They were far beyond the horizon now. The sky shimmered with an eerie glow, a beacon of the catastrophe unfolding below. And yet the radiance continued to illuminate the horizon. The sky shimmered with an eerie glow, a beacon of the catastrophe unfolding below. Ominous figures soared above the fire's light. Their wings sliced through the smoke-filled air, leaving behind trails of ember. They dove and spiraled over the blazing academy. And they unleashed from their jaws a torrent of scorching fire. The inferno devoured everything in its path, turning structures into mere cinders. "We can hope, my dear, we can hope," Arcadia said. "Now let's keep moving. I know you're tired. I know you're cold, so am I, but we have to go as fast as we can. We have to get farther away." Mercy nodded or shivered. It was difficult to discern which. Miranda dusted the snow from the child's back and legs, in an attempt to keep her from getting wetter than she already was. This drew a cautious glare from MR Rings. "Do you think the other animals got away?" Mercy asked. "I'm certain they did." Arcadia assured her they are smart. "Aren't they maybe not as smart as Mr. Rings here? After all, he managed to get a ride." Mercy nodded again and added in a hopeful voice, "I'm sure Teacup got away. She can fly." Miranda checked the girl's pack, and then her own to ensure they were still closed and cinched tight. She looked down the dark road before them. "This will take us through Kalnara and right into Aquesta," the old wizard explained. "How long will it take to get there?" Mercy asked. "Several days, a week. Perhaps longer if the weather stays bad." Miranda saw the disappointment in Mercy's eyes. "Don't worry, once we're farther away, we'll stop, rest and eat. I'll make something hot, and then we'll sleep for a bit. But for now we have to keep going. Now that we're on the road, it'll be easier." Miranda took the little girl's hand, and they set off again. She was pleased to discover that what she told the child turned out to be true. Trenches left by wagons made for easy going. Even more so due to the downhill slope, they kept a brisk pace, and soon the forest rose to blot out the fiery glow behind them. The world became dark and quiet, with only the sound of the cold wind to keep them company. Miranda glanced at the old professor as he trudged along holding his cloak tight to his neck. The skin of his face was red and blotchy, and he labored to breathe. "Are you sure you're all right?" Arcadius didn't respond at first. He drew near, forced to smile, and whispered softly in Miranda's ear, "I fear you may need to finish this journey without me." What Miranda said loudly, and glanced down at the little girl. Mercy didn't look up. "We'll stop soon. We'll rest and take our time tomorrow. We've gone a good distance today. Here, let me take your satchel." She reached out. "No, I'll hang on to it. It's very fragile, as you know, and dangerous if anyone dies carrying it. I want it to be me. As for resting, I don't think it will make a difference. I'm not strong enough for this sort of travel. We both know that you can't give up. I'm handing off the charge to you. You'll manage, but I don't know what to do. You've never told me the plan." Arcadius chuckled. "That's because it changes frequently. I had hoped to. The regions would have accepted Marcy as Medina's heir, but they refused. So now what? Medina's on the throne now, so we have a second chance. The best you can do is get to a quest and seek an audience with her. But I don't know how you'll figure it out. Introduce Mercy to the Empress. That will be a start in the right direction. Soon you'll be the only one who knows the truth. I hate placing this burden on you, but I have no choice." Miranda shook her head. "No, it was my mother who placed the burden on me, not you. A deathbed confession is a weighty thing." The old man nodded. "But doing so allowed her to die in peace. Do you think so? Or is her spirit still lingering? Sometimes I feel as if she's watching, haunting me. I'm paying the price for her weakness, her cowardice. Your mother was young, poor, and ignorant. She witnessed the death of dozens of men. the butchery of a mother and child, and narrowly escaped. She lived in constant fear that someday someone would discover there were twins, and she rescued one of them. But Miranda said bitterly, what she did was wrong and unconscionable, and the worst part is, she couldn't let the sin die with her. She had to tell me. Make it my responsibility to correct her mistakes. She should. Mercy came to an abrupt halt, tugging on Miranda's arm. Honey, we need to. She stopped upon seeing the girl's face. The faint light of an early dawn revealed fear as Mercy stared ahead to where the roads dipped toward a large stone bridge. There's a light up ahead, Arcadia said. Is it? Miranda asked. The old teacher shook his head. It's a campfire, several. It looks like more refugees. I suspect we can join with them, and the going will be easier, if I'm not mistaken. They camped on the far bank of the Gulwar. I had no idea would come so far, no wonder I'm puffing. There now, Miranda said to the girl. As they once more started forward, see, our troubles are nearly over. Maybe they'll even have a wagon that an old man can ride in. Arcadius gave a smirk, but allowed himself a smile. Things may be looking up at that. We'll be. The girl squeezed Miranda's hand and stopped once more. Up the road, figures on horseback trotted toward them. The animals snorted quite fog as their hooves drove through the ice tracks. The riders sat enveloped in dark cloaks, with hoods drawn up and scarves wrapped. It was difficult to determine much, but one thing was certain: they were just men. Miranda counted 3. They came from the south, but not from the direction of the campfires. These were not refugees. Who do you think? Miranda asked. High women. The professor shook his head. What do we do? Hopefully nothing. With luck, they're just good men coming to our aid. If not, he patted his satchel grimily, get to those campfires and ask for shelter and protection. Then see to it that Mercy reaches Aquesta, avoid the regents, and try to tell the Empress Mercy's story. Tell her the truth. But what if the horses approached and slowed? What do we have here? One rider asked. Miranda couldn't tell who spoke, but guessed it was the foremost. He studied them while they stood still, listening to the deep, throaty pant of the horses. Isn't this convenient, you said, and dismayed of all the people in the world. I was just coming to see you, old man. The leader was tall and held his side gingerly, moving stiffly. His piercing eyes glared out from under his hood, his nose and mouth shrouded by a crimson scarf, out for an early stroll in a snowstorm. He asked, closing the distance between them. Hardly, Arcadius replied. We're in flight. I'm sure you are. Clearly, if I'd waited even a day, I would have missed you and you might have slipped away. Coming to the palace was a foolish mistake. You exposed too much, and for what you should have known better. But age must bring with it a degree of desperation. He looked at Mercy. Is this the gal? Guy, Arcadia said. Sheridan is burning. The elves have crossed the Mid-Wilden. The elves have attacked. Guy. Miranda knew him, or at least his reputation. Arcadius had taught her the names of all the church's sentinels. From the professor's viewpoint, Louis Guy was the most dangerous. All sentinels were obsessed, all chosen for the rabid orthodoxy. But Guy had a legacy. His mother's maiden name was Yvonne. She had been a pious girl who had married Lord Jared Surrey, a direct descendant of the original Lord Darius Surrey, who had been charged by Patriarch Vanlin to find the heir of the old empire in the realm of air hunters. Louis Sky was a fanatic among fanatics. Don't play me for a fool, this is the girl. Child you spoke to Selder and Ethelred about, isn't it? The one you wanted to groom as the next empress. Why would you do that, old man? Why pick this girl? Is this another ruse? Or were you actually trying to slip her past us to atone for your mistake? Guy crouched down to get a better look at Mercy's face. Come here, child. No, Miranda snapped, pulling Mercy close. Guy stood up slowly, let go of the child. He ordered, "No, Sentinel Guy." Arcadia shouted, "She's just a peasant girl. An orphan I took in, is she?" He drew his sword. "Be reasonable, you have no idea what you're doing." "Oh, I think I do." Everyone was so focused on Ezra Hardin that you went by unnoticed. Who could have imagined that you would point the way to the air, not just once, but twice? The air of Navran. Are you insane? Is that why you think I spoke to the regions? Isn't it? No. He shook his head, an amused smile on his face. "I came because I suspected they hadn't thought about the question of succession, and they wanted to help educate the next imperial leader. But you insisted on this girl, only this girl. Why would you do that unless she really is the heir? That makes no sense. How could I know who the heir is? Or even if an heir still lives, how indeed that was the missing piece. You are actually the only one who could know. Tell me, Arcadius Latimer, what did your father do for a living?" "It was a weaver, but I failed to see." "Yes, so? How did the poor son of a weaver from a small village become the master of law at Sheridan University?" "I doubt your father even knew how to read, and yet his son is one of the most renowned scholars in the world. How does that happen, really, Guy? I would not think I would need to explain the merits of ambition and hard work to someone such as you." Guy sneered back. "You disappeared for 10 years, and when you came back, you knew a lot more than when you left. You're just making things up." Guy Smart, the church, doesn't let just anyone teach at their university. Did you think they didn't keep records? Of course not. I just didn't think you would see them. The old man smiled. "I'm a sentinel, you idiot. I have access to every archive in the church." "Yes, but I didn't think my scholastic ambition would be of any interest. I was a rebel in my youth, and some too." "Did the record indicate that?" "It said you found the tomb of Yalric." "Who was Yalric?" "And here I thought you knew everything. I didn't have time to linger in libraries. I was in a hurry to catch you. But why? Why are you after me? Why is your sword out?" "Because the heir of Navran must die." "She's not the heir." "Why do you think she is?" "How could I even know who the heir was?" "Because that is one of the secrets you brought back. You discovered how to locate the heir." "B.A. Really, Guy? You have quite an imagination. Now, where are the records?" "The church called you in for questioning. They thought you might have gone to Persupliquas, like that Edmund Hall fellow. And then only days after that meeting, there was a fight in the city of Radaba. A pregnant mother and her husband were killed, identified as Linother and Naron Brown. They and their child were executed by Surrey Knights. After centuries of looking, I find it interesting that my predecessor managed to locate the heir of Navran just days after the church interrogated you." Guy glared at the professor. "Did you make a deal with the church? Did you trade information in exchange for freedom? I'm sure they told you they wanted to find the heir, so they could make him king again. When you discovered what they really did, I imagined you felt used. The guilt must be awful." Guy paused for Arcadius to respond, but the professor said nothing. After that, everyone thought the bloodline had ended, didn't they? Even the patriarch had no idea another heir still lived. Then Ezra Hardin escapes, and he goes straight to Deegan. God, only Deegan isn't the heir. I was fooled for a long time too. But imagine my shock when he failed the blood test that he previously passed. No, Dad. The result of the same potion as Rahadin, used on King Amrath and Arista, that made Braga suspect the Essendons. I suppose looking back on it, we should have guessed. The wizard of the old empire wasn't a fool, and would never lead us to the real heir. But there was another, wasn't there? And you performed whatever trick you did the first time to find her. Guy peered at Mercy. What is she? A bastard child? A niece advanced toward Miranda. Hand her over. No. The old professor shouted. One of the soldiers grabbed Miranda, and the other pulled the girl from her. But let's be certain, shall we? Thou not make the same mistake twice. With a deft sweep of his wrist, Guy slashed Mercy across her hand. She screamed, and Mr. Rings hissed. That's uncalled for, Arcadia said. Watch them. Guy ordered his men while he moved to his horse. Hush, now be a brave girl for me, Miranda told Mercy. Guy carefully laid his sword on the ground, then withdrew a small leather case from his saddlebag. From it he pulled forth a set of 3 vials. He uncocked the first, tilted it slightly, and tapped on it with his finger, until a bit of powder sprinkled onto the blood-stained end of his sword. I want to leave now. Mercy whimpered as the guard held her fast. Please, can we go? Interesting, Guy muttered to himself, then applied to the contents of the next vial. This one held a liquid that hissed and fizzled while it landed on the blade. Guy, Arcadia shouted at him as he stepped forward. Very interesting. Guy continued. He uncorked the last vial. Guy, don't, the old man yelled. He poured a single drop on the tip of the sword. Pop, the sound was like a wine bottle cork coming free. And the flash was as brilliant as lightning. The sentinel stood up, staring at the end of his sword, and began to laugh. It was a strange and eerie sound, like the song of a madman. At long last, I have found the heir of Navran. The quest of my ancestors will be achieved through me. Miranda, okay? Just whispered, you could do nothing more by yourself. The old man's eyes glanced toward the refugee camp. As the morning light rose, Miranda could see several columns of smoke. Possible help was tantalizingly close, only a few hundred yards at most. I've devoted my life to correcting my mistake, but now it's up to you to do what must be done, Arcadia said. Louis. Guy took the girl and hoisted her onto his horse. We'll take her to the Patriarch. What about these two, sir? One of the hooded men said. Take the old man, kill the woman. Miranda's heart skipped. Does the soldier reach for his sword? Wait, Arcadia said. What about the horn? The old professor was backing away, clutching his satchel. The Patriarch will want the horn too, won't he? Guy's eyes flashed at the bag Arcadius held. You have it? The sentinel asked. Arcadius shot a desperate look toward Miranda, then turned and fled back down the road. Watch the child, Guy ordered one of his men. Turning to the other, he waved, and together they chased after Arcadius, who ran faster than Miranda would have ever imagined possible. She watched him, our closest friend, racing back the way they had come, his cloak flying behind him. She might have thought the side comical, except she knew what Arcadius actually had in his satchel. She knew why he was running away, what that meant, and what he wanted her to do. Miranda reached for the dagger under her cloak. She had never killed anyone before, but what choice did she have? The man standing between her and Mercy was a soldier, and likely a Surrey knight. He turned his back on her to get a better grip on Guy's horse, focusing his attention on Mercy and the hissing raccoon that snapped at him. Miranda had only seconds before Guy and the other man caught up to Arcadius. Knowing what would happen made her want to cry. They'd come so far together, sacrificed so much, and just when? It seems like they were finally close to their goal. To be stopped like this, to be murdered on a roadside. Tragic was too weak a word to frame the injustice. There would be time for tears later. The professor was counting on her, and she would not let him down. That one look had told her everything. This was the final gamble. If they could get Mercy to Medina, everything might be made right again. She drew the dagger and rushed forward with all her strength. Miranda stabbed the soldier in the back. He wasn't wearing mail or leather, and the sharp blade bit deep, passing through clothes, skin, and muscle. He spun and swatted her away. The back of his fist connected with her cheek and left her reeling from the blow. She fell to the snow, still holding the dagger, the handle slick with blood, on the horse. Mercy held tight to the saddle and screamed. The raccoon shattered its fur up. Miranda got back to her fetus. The soldier drew his sword. He was badly hurt, blood soaked his pant leg, and he staggered toward her. She tried to get away, reaching for Mercy on the horse. But the threat was faster. His sword pierced a side somewhere near her waist. She felt it go in. The pain burned, but then she suddenly felt cold. Her knees buckled. She managed to hold fast to the saddle as the horse, frightened by the violence and Mercy screaming, moved away, dragging her with it. Behind them, the soldier fell to his knees. Blood bubbling from his lips, Miranda tried to pull herself up. But her legs were useless. They hung limp, and she felt the strength draining from her arms. "Take the reins, Mercy, and hang on tight." Down the road, Guy and the other man had caught up to Arkadius. Guy, who had stopped at the sound of the girl's screams, lagged behind, but the other soldier tackled the old professor to the snow. "Mercy," Miranda said, "you need to ride over there. Ride to the campfires, beg for help, go." With her last bit of strength, she struck the horse's flank. The animal bolted forward. The saddle ripped from Miranda's hands, and she fell once more into the snow, lying on her back. She listened to the sound of the horse as it raced away. "Get on your," she heard Guy shout. But it was too late. Arkadius had opened the satchel. Even from hundreds of feet away, Miranda felt the earth shake from the explosion. An instant later, a gust of wind threw stinging snow against her face. As a cloud billowed into the morning sky, Arkadius and the man who wrestled with him died instantly. Guy was blown off his feet. The remaining horses scattered as the snowy clouds settled. Miranda stared up at the brightening sky. At the rising dawn, she wasn't cold anymore. The pain in her side was going away, growing numb along with her legs and hands. She felt a breeze cross her cheek and noticed her legs and waist were wet. A dress soaked through. She could taste iron on her tongue. Breathing became difficult, as if she were drowning. Guy was still alive. She heard him cursing the old man and calling to the horses as if they were disobedient dogs. The crunch of snow, the rub of leather. Then the sound of hooves galloping away. She was alone in the silence of the cold winter's dawn. It was quiet, peaceful. Tia Meriper Emi, she prayed aloud to the brightening sky. "O Father of Navran, creator of men." She took her last breath and with it said, "Take care of your only daughter." Belinda Lenaclin crept out of her tent into the brisk morning air. She wore her thickest wool dress and 2 layers of fur. But still she shivered. The sun was just rising, a cold milky haze in the soup of a heavy winter sky. The clouds had lingered for more than a week, and she wondered if she would ever see the sun's bright face again. Belinda stood on the packed snow, looking around at the dozens of tents pitched among the pine forest thieves. Campfires burned in blackened snow pits, creating gray tailies of smoke that wagged with the wind. Among them wandered figures, hooded and bundles, such that it should have been difficult to identify male from female, yet there was no such dilemma. They were all women. The camp was filled with them, as well as children and the elderly. People walked with bowed heads, picking the way carefully through the trampled snow. Everything appeared so different in the light, so quiet, so still. The previous night had been a terror of fire. Screams and a flight along the Westfield Road. They'd paused only briefly to take a head count. Before pushing on, Helen had been so exhausted that she barely recalled the camp being said, "Good morning, my lady." Emily greeted her from beneath a blanket, which was wrapped over her cloak. Her words lacked their normal cheerfulness. Belinda's maid had always been bright and playful. In the morning now she stood with somber diligence, her reddened hands quivering, her jaw shaking with the chill. "Is it Emmy?" Belinda cast another look around. "How can you tell? Let's find you some breakfast. Something warm will make you feel better." "My father and brothers are dead," Alenda replied. "The world is ending. How can breakfast possibly help? I don't know, my lady, but we must try. It's what your father wanted, for you to survive, I mean. It's why he stayed behind, isn't it?" A loud boom, like a crack of thunder, echoed from the north. Every head turned to look out across the snowy fields. Every face terrified at the end had arrived at last, reaching the center of the camp. Helena found Belinda Pickering her daughter Linaire, old Julian Melungow's Lord High Chamberlain, and Lord Valen, the party's sole protector. The elderly knights had led them through the chaos the night before. Among them, they composed the last vestiges of the royal court, at least those still in Melungar. King Ulrich was an equester, lending a hand in the brief civil war, and saving his sister Arista from execution. It is to him they now fled. We have no idea, but it's foolish to stay any longer. Lord Valen was saying yes. I agree, Belinda replied. Lord Valen turned to a young boy. Send word to rouse everyone. We will break camp immediately. Emmy, Belinda said, turning to a maid. Run back and pack our things. Of course, my lady. Emily curtsied and headed toward their tent. What was that sound? Belinda asked. Linaire wrongly shrugged, her face frightened. The Nair Pickering was lovely as always, despite the horrors, the flight and the primitive condition of the camp. She was radiant, even disheveled, and hastily grabbed cloak, with her blonde hair spilling out of her hood. She remained stunning, just as a sleeping baby is always precious. She'd gotten this blessing from her mother, just as the Pickering men were renowned for the swordsmanship. So too were the Pickering women, celebrated for their beauty. Laner's mother, Belinda, was famous for it. All that was over now. What had been Constance only the day before, when I lost, beyond a gulf too wide to clearly see across. Although at times it appeared that Linaire tried, Alender often had seen her staring north at the horizon. The sky shimmered with an eerie glow, a beacon of the catastrophe unfolding below. With a look somewhere between desperation and remorse, searching for ghosts, in her arms, Linaire still held her father's legendary sword. The Count had handed it to her, begging that she delivered it safely to her brother, Morgan. Then he had kissed each member of his family before returning to the line, where Alender's own father and brothers waited with the rest of the army. Since then, Linaire had never set the burden down. She'd wrapped it in a dark wool blanket and bound it with a silk ribbon throughout the harrowing escape. She'd hugged the long bundle to her breast, at times using it to wipe away tears. If we push hard today, we might make Kolnara by sunset, Lord Valen told them, assuming the weather improves. The old knight glared up at the sky, as if it alone were their adversary. Lord Julian, Belinda said, the relics, the scepter and seal are all safe, my lady. The ancient chamberlain replied, loaded in the wagons. The kingdom is intact, save for the land itself. The old man looked back, in the direction of the strange sound, toward the banks of the Galewa River, and the bridge they had crossed the night before. Will they help us in Kolnara? Belinda asked. We haven't much food, if news has reached them of King Ulrich's part in fleeing the Empress. They should be willing, Lord Valen said, even if it has not. Kolnara is a merchant city, and the merchants thrive on profit, not chivalry. I have some jewelry, Belinda informed him. If needs be, you can sell what I have for. The Countess paused as she noticed Julian still staring back at the bridge. Others soon lifted their gazers, and finally, Alenda looked up to see the approach of a rider. Is it the knee began? It's a child, Belinda said. Alenda quickly realized she was right. A little girl raced at them, clutching to the back of the sweat-soaked horse, her hood blown back revealing long, dark hair and rosy cheeks. She was about 6 years old, and just as she clutched the horse, A raccoon held fast to her. They were an odd pair to be alone on the road. But Alenda reminded herself that normal no longer existed if she should see a bear in a feather cap. Riding a chicken that too might be normal now. The horse entered the camp, and Lord Valen grabbed the bit, forcing the animal and rider to a stop. "Are you all right, honey?" Belinda asked. "There's blood on the saddle," Lord Valen noted. "Are you hurt?" the Countess asked the child. "Where are your parents?" The girl shivered and blinked, but said nothing. Her little fists still clutched the horse's reins. "She's as cold as ice," Belinda said, touching the girl's cheek. "Help me get her down." "What's your name?" Alenda asked. The girl remained mute, deprived of her horse. She turned to hugging the raccoon. "Another rider," Lord Valen announced. Alenda looked up to see a man crossing the bridge and wheeling toward them. The rider charged into the camp and threw back his hood, revealing long black hair, pale skin, and intense eyes. He bore a narrow mustache and a short beard, trimmed to a fine point. He glared at them until he spotted the girl. "There," he said, pointing. "Give her to me at once." A child cried out in fear, shaking her head. "No," Belinda shouted, and pressed the girl into Alenda's hands. "My lady," Lord Valen said, "if the child is his, this child does not belong to him." The Countess declared, a tone hateful. "I'm a sentinel of Nephron." The man shouted to all who could hear, "This child is claimed for the church. You will hand her over now, and you oppose me will die." "I know very well who you are, Louis Sky," Belinda said, seething. "I will not provide you with any more children to murder." The sentinel appeared at her. Countess Pickering. He studied the camp with renewed interest. "Where is your husband? Where is your fugitive son?" "I am no fugitive," Danik said as he came forward. Belinda's youngest had recently turned 13 and was growing tall and lanky. He was well on his way to imitating his older brothers. "He means more than," Belinda explained. "This is the man who murdered Fannin. Again I ask you." Guy pressed, "Where is your husband?" "He's dead, and Marvin is well beyond your reach." The sentinel looked out over the crowd, and then down at Lord Valen. "And he has left you poor protection. Now hand over the child." "I will not," Belinda said. Guy dismounted and stepped forward to face Lord Valen. "Hand over the child, or I will be forced to take her." The old knight looked to Belinda, whose face remained hateful. "My lady does not wish it, and I shall defend her decision." The old man drew his sword. "You will leave now." Belinda jumped at the sound of steel, as Guy drew his own sword and lunged in less than an instant. Lord Valen was clutching his bleeding side, his sword arm wavering with the shake of his head. The sentinel slapped the old man's blade away and stabbed him through the neck. Guy advanced toward the girl with a terrifying fire in his eyes. Before he could cross the distance, Belinda stepped between them. "I do not make a habit of killing women," Guy told her, "but nothing will keep me from this prize." "What do you want her for?" "As you said, to kill her. I will take the child to the patriarch, and then she must die by my hands." "Never. You cannot stop me." "Look around. You've only women and children. You have no one to fight for. You give me that child." Mother Linner said softly, "Is right. There is no one else. Please, Mother, let me." Danik pleaded, "No, you're still too young. Your sister is right. There's no one else." The Countess nodded toward her daughter. "I am pleased to see someone who dies stopped." As Linner stepped forward, she slipped off her cloak and untied the bundle, revealing the sword of her father, which he drew forth and held before her. The blade caught the hazy winter light, pulling it in and casting it back in a sharp brilliance. Puzzled Guy looked at her for a moment. "What is this?" "You killed my brother Linner," said Guy. Looked to Belinda. "You're not serious. Just this once, Linner." Belinda told her daughter, "You would have your daughter die for this child." "If I must kill all your children, I will." Belinda watched terrified as everyone backed away. leaving a circle around Sentinel Guy and Lanier. A ripping wind shuddered the canvas of the tents, and threw Lanier's golden hair back, standing alone in the snow. Dressed in her white traveling clothes, and holding the rapier, she appeared as a mythical creature, a fairy queen or goddess, beautiful in her elegance with a skull. Louis' Sky lunged, and with surprising speed and grace, Lanier slapped the attack away. Her father's sword sang with the contact. "You've handled a blade before." Guy said, surprised, "I am a Pickering." He swung at her, she blocked. He swiped, she parried. Then Lanier slashed and cut Guy across the cheek. "Lanier," her mother said with a stern tone, "don't play games." Guy paused, holding a hand to his bleeding face. "He killed Fan," and Mother Lanier said coldly, "He should be made to suffer. He should be made an example." "No," Melinda said. "It's not our way. Your father wouldn't approve. You know that. Just finish it." "What is this?" Guy demanded, but there was a hesitation in his voice. "You're a woman. I told you I'm a Pickering, and you killed my brother." Guy began to raise his sword. Lanier stepped and lunged. A thin rapier pierced the man's heart and was withdrawn. Before he finished his stroke, Louis' Sky fell dead face down in the blood-soaked snow. Chapter 2, Nightmares. Arista woke up screaming. Her body trembled. Her stomach suffered from a sinking sensation, the remaining residue of a dream she couldn't remember. She sat up, her left hand crawling to her chest, but she felt the thundering of her heart. It was pounding so hard, so fast, beating against her ribs as if needing to escape. She tried to remember. She could only recall brief snippets, tiny bits that appeared to be disjointed and unrelated. The one constant was Ezra Hayden, his voice so distant and weak, she could never hear what he said. A thin linen nightgown clung to her skin, soaked with sweat. A bed sheet stripped from the mattress, spilled to the floor. The quilt, embroidered with designs of spring flowers, lay wadded up nearly on the other side of the room. Ezra Hayden's robe, however, rested neatly next to her. Giving off a faint blue radiance, the garment appeared as if a maid had prepared it. For her morning dressing, Arista's hand was touching it. "How is it on the bed?" Arista looked at the wardrobe. The door she remembered closing hung open, and a chill ran through her. She was alone. A soft knock at the door startled her. Arista Ulrich's voice came from the other side. She threw the robe around her shoulders, and immediately felt warmer, safer. "Come in," she called. A brother opened the door and appeared in, holding a candle a bit above his head, dressed in a burgundy robe. He had a thick baldric buckled around his waist, the sword of Essendon hanging at his side. The weapon was huge, and as he entered Rick used one hand to tilt it up, to keep the tip from dragging on the floor. The sight reminded her of the night her father was murdered, the night Ulrich became king. "I heard you cry out. Are you all right?" he asked, his eyes searching the room and settling on the glowing robe. "I'm fine. Just a nightmare. Another one. You sighed, you know. It might help if you didn't sleep in that thing." He gestured toward the robe, sleeping in a dead man's clothes. "It's creepy, sort of sick, really. Don't forget he was a wizard. That thing could be, well, I'll just say it is enchanted. I'm sure it's responsible. Do you want to talk about your dream? I don't remember much like all the others. I don't know, it's hard to describe. There's this sense of urgency that's overwhelming. I feel this need to find something that if I don't, I'll die. I always wake up terrified, like I'm walking off a cliff and don't see it." "Can I get you something?" he asked. "Water, tea, soup." "Soup? Where will you get soup in the middle of the night?" You shrugged. "I just thought I'd ask. You don't have to beat me up for it. I hear you scream. I jump out of bed and rush to your door. I offer to play servant for you, and this is the thanks I get." "I'm sorry." She frowned playfully but meant what she said. Having him there did chase the shadows away. and took her mind off the wardrobe. She patted her bed. "Sit down." Ulrich hesitated, then set the candle on her knitstand and took a seat beside her. "What happened to the sheets and the quilt? Looks like you were wrestling." "Maybe I can't remember." "You look terrible." "You said thanks." You sighed. "I'm sorry." "I'm sorry, but you're still my little brother. And this new, protective side of yours is hard to get used to. Remember when I fell off Tamarascan, broke my ankle? It hurts so bad that I couldn't see straight. When I asked you to get help, you just stood there laughing and pointing. I was 12, you were a brat. You frowned at her, but you're not anymore." She took his hand and cupped it in both of hers. "Thank you for checking on me. You even wore your sword." "All right, look down." "I didn't know what beast-star scoundrel might be attacking. The princes had to come prepared to do battle. Can you even draw that thing?" He frowned at her again. "Oh, quit it, will you? They say I fought masterfully in the Battle of Medford." "Masterfully?" He struggled to stop himself from smiling. "Yes, some might even say heroically. In fact, I believe some did say heroically. You've watched that silly play too many times. It's good theater, and I like to support the arts." "The arts?" She rolled her eyes. "You just like it because it makes all the girls swoon. And you love all the attention." "Well," he shrugged guiltily, "don't deny it. I've seen you with a crowd of them, circling like vultures and you grinning. And strutting around like the prize bullet, the fair. Do you make a list? Does Julian send them to your chambers by hair color, height, or merely in alphabetical order? It's not like that. No, you do have to get married, and the sooner the better. You have a lineage to protect. Kings who don't produce heirs cause civil wars. You sound like father. Never forbid I should have any enjoyment in my life. I have to be king. Don't make me have to be a husband and father too. You might as well just lock me up and get it over with. Besides, there's plenty of time. I'm still young and make it sound like I'm teaching on the edge of my grave. And what about you? You're pushing old maid starters now. Shouldn't we be searching for suitable nobles? Do you remember when you thought? I arranged a marriage for you with Prince Rudolph and Arista. Are you all right? She turned away, wiping the moisture from her eyes. I'm fine. I'm sorry. She felt his hand on her shoulder. It's okay, she replied, and coughed to clear her throat. You know I would never. I know it's all right, really. She sniffled and wiped her nose. They sat in silence for a few minutes. Then Arista said, I would have married Hilford. You know I don't care what you are. The council would have said. A look of surprise came over him. Since when have you ever cared, Alfred, huh? He smirked and shook his head. She glared back. It's not what you think, he said. What is it then, she asked with an accusing tone, thinking of the boy who had laughed at her falling from her horse. Had reappeared. No, it's like to hell, Fred. But I liked him. He was a good man and loved you very much, but he wasn't noble, she interrupted. Well, listen, wait, my brother held up a hand. Let me finish. I don't care if he was noble or not. Truth is, he was nobler than just about anyone I can think of. Except maybe that Breckton fellow. How Hilfred managed to stand by you every day. While not saying anything, that was real chivalry. He wasn't denied. But he's the only one I ever saw who acted like one. No, it's not because he wasn't noble born. And it's not because he wasn't a great guy. I would have loved to have him as a brother. But then she asked, this time confused. Ulrich looked at her, and in his eyes was the same expression she had seen when he had found her in the dark of the imperial prison. You didn't love him, he said simply. The words shocked her. She didn't say anything. She couldn't say anything. I don't think there was anyone in Essendon Castle who didn't know how Hilfred felt. Why didn't you? He asked. She couldn't help it. She started crying. Arista, I'm sorry. She shook her head, trying to get enough air into her lungs to speak. No, you're right. You're right. She couldn't keep her lips from quivering. But I would have married him just the same. I would have made him happy. Ulrich reached out and pulled her close. She buried her head into the thick folds of his robe and squeezed. They didn't say anything for a long while. And then Arista sat up and wiped her face. She took a breath. So when did you get so romantic anyway? Since when does love have anything to do with marriage? You don't love any of the girls you spend your time with. And that's why I'm not married. Really surprised, I guess. I just remember Mom and Dad. You know, Arista narrowed her eyes at him. He married Mother because she was Etherwood's niece. And he needed the leverage with Warwick to combat the trade war with Chadwick and Gloucester. Maybe at the start, but they grew to love each other. Father used to tell me that wherever he was. If Mom was there, it was home. I always remember that. I've never found anyone who made me feel that way. Have you? She hesitated for a moment. She considered telling him the truth. Then just shook her head. They sat in silence. Then finally Ulrich rose. Are you sure I can't get you anything? No, but thank you. It means a lot to know that you care. He started to leave, and as he reached the door, she said, Eric, remember when you and Marvin were planning on going to Persepliquas? Oh yeah. Believe me, I think about that a lot these days. What I wouldn't give to be able to do. You know where it is? Persepliquas. No one does. Marvin and I were just hoping we'd be the ones to stumble on it. Typical kids stuff. Like slaying a dragon or winning the Wintertide Games. It sure would have been fun to look though. Instead, I guess I have to go home and look for a bride. She make me wear shoes at dinner, I know she will. Ulrich left, closing the door softly behind him. And leaving her in the blue glow of the robe, she laid back down with her eyes open, studying the stone and mortar above her bed. She saw where the artisan had scraped his trowel, leaving an impression frozen in time. The light of the robe shifted with her breaths, creating the illusion of movement and giving her the sensation of being underwater, as if the ceiling were the lighted surface of a winter pond. It felt like she was drowning, trapped beneath the thick slab of solid blue ice. She closed her eyes. It didn't help. Soup, she thought. Warm, tasty, comforting soup. Perhaps it wasn't such a bad idea after all. Maybe someone would be in the kitchen. She had no idea what time it was. It was dark, but it was also winter. Still, it had to be early. Since there had been no scuttling of castle servants past a door, it didn't matter. She wouldn't fall back to sleep now, so she might as well get up. If no one was awake, she might manage on her own. The idea of doing something for herself, of being useful, got her going. She was actually excited as her feet hit the cold stone, and she looked around for her slippers. The robe glowed brighter, as if sensing her need when she entered the dark hall. It remained bright until she descended the stairs. As she entered into the torch light, the robe dimmed until it only reflected the firelight. She was disappointed to find several people already at work in the kitchen. Cora, the stocky dairy maid with the bushy eyebrows and rosy cheeks, was at work churning butter near the door, pumping the plunger in a steady rhythm. Trading one hand for another, the young boy Nieper, with his shoulders powdered in snow, stomped his feet as he entered from the dark courtyard carrying an armload of wood, pausing to shake his head like a dog. He threw a spray that garnered a curse from Cora. Leaf and Ibis stoked the stoves, crumbling to each other about damp tinder. Leela stood on a ladder like a circus performer, pulling down the teetering bowls stacked on the top shelf. Edith Mon had always insisted on having them dusted at the start of each month. While the ogre herself was gone, her tyranny lived on. Arista had looked forward to rustling around in the darkened scullery, searching for a meal like a mouse. Now her adventure was ruined, and she considered returning upstairs. To avoid an awkward encounter, Arista knew all the scullery servants. From her days posing as Ella, the chambermaid, she might be a princess, but she was also a liar. A spy and of course a witch. Do they hate me? Fear me? There was a time when the thought of servants hadn't bothered her, a time when she hardly noticed them at all. Standing at the bottom of the steps, watching them scurry around the chilly kitchen, she couldn't determine if she had gained wisdom or lost innocence. Arista pivoted, hoping to escape unnoticed, back up the stairs to the sheltered sanctuary of her chamber, and she spotted the monk. He sat on the floor near the wash basins, where the stone was wet from a leaky plug. His back rested against the lye barrel. He was small, thin, and dressed in the traditional russered frock of the Order of the Monks of Maribor, delighted by rubbing the shaggy sides of Red, the big elk count who sat before him. He had a great smile on his face. The dog was a fixture in the kitchen. Perry routinely cleared scraps. The dog's eyes were closed, his long tongue hung dripping, and his body rocked as the monk scratched him. Arista hadn't seen much of Myron since the day he had arrived at the castle. So much had happened since then that she forgot he was still there. Walking forward, she adjusted her robe, straightening it and fixing the collar. The heads looked up. Cora was the first to see her. The pace of her plunging slowed. Her eyes tracked Arista's movements with interest. Nipper, having dropped his load, stood up and was in the process of brushing the snow off when he stopped in mid-stroke. "Ella, forgive me, Your Highness. I was the first to speak." "Actually, I prefer Arista," she replied. "I couldn't sleep. I was hoping to maybe get a little soup." I burst, grinned knowingly. "It can get cold up in them towers, can't it, as it happens? I saved a pot of last night's venison stew. Throws it out in the snow. If that's all right, I have Nipper fetch it. I can heat it up into shakes. It'll warm you nicely. How about some hot cider and cinnamon to go with it? Still got some that ain't quite turned yet. It'll have a bit of a bite, but it's still good." "Yes, thank you. That would be wonderful. I have someone running up to your chambers. You're on the 3rd floor, right?" "Ah, no, actually. I was thinking of eating down here, if that's okay." I was chuckled. "Of course it is. Bug's been doing that good deal these days. And I'm sure you can eat anywhere that pleases you. Except in maybe the Empress's bedroom course. Rumor has it that you did that already." It chuckled. "It's just that." She looked at the others, all of whom were watching and listening. "I thought I might not be welcome after lying to all of you." The cook made a dismissive sound. "You forget we worked for Sodder and Ethered. All they ever did was lie. And they sure never scrubbed floors or empty. No chamber pots along with us. You take a seat at the table, Your Highness. I'll get you that stew, Nipper. Fetch the pot and get me the jug of cider too." She took a seat as instructed. And whether they agreed with Ibis's sentiments or not, none of them said a word. They returned to work, and only occasionally glanced at her. Leela even ventured a tiny smile and a modest wave, before returning to a struggle with the bowls. "You're Myron Lanaklan, aren't you?" Arista asked, turning on her stool to face the monk and the dark. He looked up surprised. Yes, I am pleased to meet you. I'm Arista. I believe you know my brother Ulrich." "Of course, how is he?" "He's fine. Haven't you seen him? It's just upstairs." The monk shook his head, no longer being scratched. Red opened his eyes and looked at Myron with a decidedly disappointed expression. "Isn't he wonderful?" Myron declared. "I've never seen a dog this big. I didn't know what he was at first. I thought he might be a shaggy breed of deer that they housed in the kitchen, much like we used to keep pigs and chickens at the Abbey. I was so happy to discover he was not a future meal. His name is Red. He's an elk hound, although I think his days of hunting wolves and boar are over. Did you know that in times of war, they can take knights down off horses? They kill their prey by biting the neck and crushing the spine. But really, he's not vicious at all. I come down here every day to see him. Do you always get up this early? Oh, this isn't early at the Abbey. This would be lazy. You must go to sleep early then. Actually, I don't sleep much, he said as he resumed petting the dog. Me neither, she admitted. Bad dreams. Myron looked surprised again. He stopped stroking Red, who nosed his hand in protest. She thought he was about to say something, but then he returned his attention to the dog. Byron, I'm wondering if you can help me, she asked. Of course, what are the nightmares about? Oh no. I wasn't speaking of that. It's just that my brother mentioned. You read quite a bit. He shrugged. I found a little library on the 3rd floor, but there are only about 20 books there. I'm on my 3rd time through. You've read all the books in the library. 3 times almost. I always have trouble with Hartenford's genealogy of Warwick monarchs. It's almost all names, and I have to sound most of them. What you need to know. I was actually thinking about information you might have read about. While at the Wines Abbey, have you ever heard of the city of Persepolis? He nodded. It's the capital city of the original Empire of Navran. Yes, she said eagerly. Do you know where it is? He thought a moment and smiled to himself. In every text, they always refer to everything else by way of it. Denver's 25 leagues southeast of Persepolis. Barrington 100 leagues due north. No one ever mentioned where Persepolis was. I presume because everyone already knew. If I got you a map, would it be possible to find it? Based on the references to other places, maybe. I'm pretty sure that's how Edmund Hall found it. Although all you really need is his journal. I've always wanted to read that one. I thought reading his journal is considered heresy. Isn't that why they locked Hall and his journal in the top of the Crown Tower? Yes, and yet you would still read it. Auric never mentioned what a rebel you are. Myron looked puzzled, then smiled. It is heresy for a member of the Nephrin Church to read it. Oh, that's right. You're a monk of Maribor and Blestley. We have no such restrictions on our reading material. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Arista said all the things that might be hidden at the top of the Crown Tower. Makes you wish you could get inside, doesn't it? Yes, it does. They arrived late that evening. The whole castle buzzing with the news. Trumpets blared, servants rushed, and before she could get dressed, 2 servants as well as Ulrich and Marthan had stopped by to tell Arista of the caravan that had just arrived from the north, bearing the falcon crest and the banners of gold and green. She hoisted the hem of the robe and raced down the steps with the rest. A crowd formed on the front steps. Servants, artisans, bureaucrats, and nobles mingled and pushed to see the sight. Guards formed an aisle allowing her to pass to the front, where she stood next to Marvin and Ulrich. To her left she spotted Nimbus, draping Amelia's shoulders with his cloak, leaving the skinny man looking like a twig in the wind. She didn't see the Empress. Wind-whipped torches and a milky moon illuminated the courtyard. As the caravan entered, there were no soldiers, just elderly men who walked behind carriages. Toward the rear of the procession came wagons, bearing a shivering cargo. Women and children crammed tightly together, huddled for warmth beneath communal blankets. The first carriage reached the bottom of the steps, and Belinda and Lanier Pickering's stepdad, followed by Elenda Lenaclin. The 3 women looked up at the crowd before them, hesitantly. Marvin ran forward to embrace his mother. What are you all doing here? He exclaimed excitedly. Where's father? Didn't he? Arista saw more than stiffen and pull back. There was no joy at this meeting. The women's faces were sorrowful. They were pale, drawn, and gray, and only their eyes and noses held color. Red and sore from crying and the bitter wind, Melinda held her son. bringing his clothes with her fists. "Your father is dead," she cried and buried her face in his chest, moving slower than the rest. Julian Tempest, the elderly Lord Chamberlain of Maylonger, climbed carefully down out of the carriage. When Arista saw him, her stomach tightened. She could think of very few things that might cause Julian to leave Maylonger, and none of them good. The O's have crossed the Midwilden River, Julian announced to the crowd. His voice fought against the wind that viciously fluttered the flags and banners. He walked gingerly, placing his feet upon the frozen ground, as if it might be pulled out from beneath them. The old man, stately robes snapped about him like living things, his cap threatening to fly off. "They've invaded and taken all of Dunmore and Ghent." He paused, looking at King Ulrich, took a breath and said, "And Maylonger, the north has fallen." Two elves are expanded, incredulous. "But how? These are not the mere, your majesty. They are not the half-breeds we are familiar with. Those that attacked are pure, blooded elves of the Aravan Empire. Terrible, fierce, and merciless, they came out of the east and crushed all in their path." The wine gained a grip on the old man's cap, throwing it across the yard and revealing his balding head. Wreathed in thin white hair, his hands flew up in a futile effort and remained at face level, quivering and forgotten. "Woe to the house of Essendon, the kingdom is lost." Oric's gaze lifted to the caravan. He stood staring at the long line of wagons, studying its length, the number of faces crawling from them. And Arista knew what he was thinking. Is this all? Julian and the ladies were ushered inside. Arista watched the manta, but remained on the steps. She recognized a face or two. One had been a barmaid at the Rose and Thorn, another the seamstress of the castle. Arista had often seen her daughter playing near the moat, with a doll her mother had made from scraps. She didn't have the doll now, and Arista wondered what became of it. What became of everything? There's not that many. Amelia was saying to Sebastian. He was a ranking castle guard, but she couldn't recall his specific position. Find room for them in the gallery for now. He snapped a salute, and have someone run and tell Ibis to get some food prepared. They look hungry. Amelia turned back toward the castle doors when she made eye contact with Arista. She bit her lip in a sad expression. "I'm sorry," she managed to say, and then walked away. Arista remained on the steps as the stable hands broke down. The harnesses and the wagons emptied. A line of refugees filed past her, heading inside. "Melissa," Arista called. "Your Highness." Melissa curtsied. "Oh, forget that." She ran down the remaining steps and gave the girl a hug. "I'm so happy you're all right." "Are you the Empress?" a little girl asked, holding on to Melissa's hand. Arista had been away from Maylonger for some time, only a few months short of a year. But this child couldn't have been Melissa's. The girl had to be 6 or 7. She stood on the step beside Arista's maid, bouncing on anxious feet and clutching a bundle to her chest with her free hand. "This is Mercy," Melissa said, introducing her. "We found her on the way here." She lowered her voice and whispered, "She's an orphan." There was something familiar about the little girl. Arista was certain she had seen her before. "No, I'm sorry. I'm not the Empress. My name is Arista. Can the first see the Empress?" "I'm afraid not. The Empress is very busy." The child's eager expression collapsed to one of disappointment, and her head drooped to look at her feet. Arcadius said, "I would meet the Empress when we got to Aquesta." Arista studied her face a moment. "Arcadius, oh yes. I remember you. We met last summer, wasn't it?" Arista looked around the few remaining refugees, but didn't see her old teacher among them. Just then she noticed the bundle move. "What have you got in there?" Before the girl could answer, the head of a raccoon poked out. "Its name is Mr. Rings." Arista bent down, and as she did, the robe brightened slightly, a soft pink glow. The girl's eyes widened excitedly. "Magic," she exclaimed. She reached out, then paused and looked up. You can touch it, Arista told her. It's slippery, she said, rubbing the material between her fingers. Arcadius could do magic too. Where's Arcadius? The little girl didn't answer. As she shivered in the cold, oh, I'm sorry. You both must be freezing, let's get inside. They stepped from the pale blue winter into the dark. Violet Hall, the howl of the wind silenced at the closing of the doors, which boomed echoing in the vaulted chamber. The little girl looked up in awe at the flight of steps, the stone columns and arches. A number of refugees wrapped in blankets shivered. As they waited for directions, Your Highness, Melissa whispered. We found Mercy alone on a horse, alone. But where is she? Hesitated. Seeing Melissa's downcast eyes, Mercy hasn't said much, but well, I'm sorry. The light of a robe dimmed and the color turned blue. He's dead, first Esarhaddon, now Arcadius. The elves burnt Gant, Melissa said. Sheridan and Irvanon are gone, burned. But the Tower of Glen Morgan, the Crown Tower. Melissa shook her head. We joined with some people fleeing south. Several saw it fall. One said it looked like a child's toy being toppled. Everything is gone. Melissa's eyes glistened. There, unstoppable. Arista expected tears, but all she felt was a numbness. Too much loss all at once. She gently touched Mercy's cheek. Can I let Mr. Rings play in here? Mercy asked. What? Oh, I suppose as long as you keep a sharp eye on him. Arista said there's an L count that might gobble him up. If he goes too far, she set the raccoon down. It sniffed the floor and cautiously skidded to the wall near the steps, where it began, a systematic smelling along the baseboards. Mercy followed and took a seat on the lower step. I can't believe Arcadius is dead. At wintertide the Euliphimar ends. They will come without the horn, everyone dies. The words of Esarhaddon echoed in Arista's head, words of warning, mingled with words she didn't fully understand. Mercy yawned and rested her chin on her hands. As Mr. Rings inched along the length of the step, exploring the world, she's tired, barista said. I think they're handing out soup in the Great Hall. Would you like some soup, Mercy? The girl looked up, smiled, and nodded. Mr. Rings is hungry too. Aren't you, Mr. Rings? The city was more beautiful than anything Arista had ever seen. White buildings taller than the highest tree, taller than any building she'd ever seen, rose up like slender fingers reaching for the sky. Sweeping pennants of greens and blues trailed from their pinnacles, snapping in the breeze and shimmering like crystal. A road broad enough for carriages, straight to the maple and paved with smooth stone. LED into the city. Upon it moved a multitude of wagons, carts, wains, coaches, and buggies. No wall or gate hindered the flow of traffic. No guardhouse gave them pause. The city lacked towers, barbican, and moat. It stood naked and beautiful, fearless and proud, with only a pair of sculptured lions to intimidate visitors. The breath of the city was hard to accept, hard for her to believe. It dominated 3 full hills and filled to the vast valley where a gentle river flowed. It was a lovely place, and it was so familiar. Arista, you must remember. She fell to the urgency. A tightness in her stomach, a chill across her back. Arista had to think she needed to solve the puzzle. So little time remained, but such a sight as this would be impossible to forget. She couldn't have seen it before. You were here. She was not. Such a place as this could not even exist. This was a dream, an illusion. You must trust me, you were here. Look closely. Arista was shaking her head. It was ridiculous, and yet something about the river, the way it curved near the base of the northern hill. Yes, the hill. The hill did look familiar, and the road not so wide. It had been overgrown and hidden. She remembered finding it in the dark. She remembered wondering how it had come to be there. Yes, you were here on the hill. Look at the iguanan. Arista didn't understand the northern hill. Look at the temple on the crest. She spotted it. Yes, it was familiar, but it didn't look the same in her memory. It was broken, fallen, mostly buried, but it was the same. Arista had been there, and it frightened her to remember. Something bad had happened to her here. She had nearly died on this hill before, the broken stones, amidst the splintered remains of shattered columns and breaching slabs, but she had not died. She did something on that hill, something awful something. That made her rip the dewy grass with her fists and beg Maribor for forgiveness. At last Arista understood where she was, what she was seeing. This is it, this was my home. Go there, dig down. Find the tomb, bring forth the horn. Do it, Arista. You must, there is no time left. Everyone will die, everyone will die. Everyone will. Arista woke up screaming. Chapter 3. Prisons. Get out of the way, Adrian shouted, his voice booming through the corridor. He stood just a few feet from the guard, glaring at him. Breathing on him, the two guards who watched from the end of the hall ran forward. You heard the chainmail jingling, their empty scabbards slapping their thighs. Both stopped short of sword's length. It's the Tesla, one warned and whisper. The soldier who blocked the door stood his ground. Adrian sensed the tension, the fear, the lack of confidence, but he also felt the courage and loyalty that refused to let him waver. He usually respected such qualities in the man, but not this time. This man was merely in his way. Behind him a latch lifted and a door creaked. "What's going on?" a befuddled woman's voice asked. Adrian glanced. It was Amelia. She shuffled forward, wiping her eyes and fumbling with the tie of her robe. "I need to speak to the Empress," he growled. "Tell them to stand down." "It's the middle of the night," she exclaimed in a whisper. "You can't see her if you want. I'll try to arrange an appointment in the morning. But I must tell you, her remnants is very busy. The news." Adrian's hands rose and he took hold of his sword grips. The three soldiers tensed, and all but the door guard took a step back. The man before him let his own hands settle slowly on his weapon. But he didn't pull it. This guard's a cool one, Adrian thought, and took another half step closer. "Until the nose is nearly touched. Get out of my way." "Adrian, what are you doing this time?" It was Arista's voice echoing down the hallway. "I'm seeking an audience with the Empress," he said through gritted teeth. He broke his stare to turn and see the princess, trotting up the 5th-floor corridor, as always these days. She was dressed in Ezra Hardin's robe, which was a dull blue and at the moment only reflected the fire of the torches hanging in the wall sconces. "They have them locked up. They won't even let me see him," Adrian told her. Royce, he didn't want to kidnap the Empress, but he would have done anything to get Gwen back. They should give him a medal for killing Salder. And Merrick, Adrian sighed. Gwen died in his arms. He wasn't thinking straight. He never meant to harm Medina. "I found out he's being held in the North Tower. I don't think Medina even knows, so I'm going to tell her don't try and stop me." "I'm not," she said. "I have to see her as well." "What for?" The princess looked uncomfortable. "I had a bad dream." "What?" "No one is seeing the Empress tonight," Amelia declared. 6 more guards arrived, trotting toward them. "I turn at the whole castle regiment if I have to." Adrian glanced at the Imperial Secretary. "Do you think they'll stop me?" "The door has a boat on the inside," the door guard said. "Even if you got past us, there's half a foot of solid oak in your way." "That won't be a problem," rest assured them. "But I should warn you, I can't be responsible for wounds from flying splinters." A robe began to glow. It gave off a hazy gray light that slowly brightened, bleaching their faces and weakening the torch-fed shadows. Adrian noticed a faint breeze in the corridor. A warm wind was rising, swirling around a rooster like a tiny cyclone, fluttering the hem of her robe and the ends of her hair. Amelia stared horrified. "Open the door, Amelia, or I'll remove it." Amelia looked as if she might scream. "Let them in, Gerald." The voice emanated from the other side of the door. "Your Eminence." "Yes, Gerald, it isn't locked. Let them in." The door guard lifted the latch and gave a push. The door swung inward, revealing the darkness of the imperial bedroom. Amelia said nothing. She was breathing faster than normal. Her fists clenched at her sides. Adrian entered first with Arista behind, both followed by Amelia and Gerald. It was cold in the bedroom. The fireplace was dark, and the only light came in through the open window. In the firewall to either side, sheer white curtains pillowed inward, dancing in the faint moonlight like a pair of ghosts. Dressed in only her nightgown, Empress Medina rested on the floor, looking out of the stars. She sat on her knees, hands in her lap, her shoulders drawn up against the cold, bare toes poked out from within. The pool of white linen that gathered around her. Blonde hair fell down her back in tangles. She appeared much like the girl Hadron had seen under the Traceman's arch. In Kalnara so long ago, they arrested Royce, agent told her. They've locked him in a cell in the tower. I know, you know, he said incredulously. How long have I ordered it? Adrian stared at her, stunned. Praise. I mean Medina. He said softly, you don't understand. He never meant to harm you. He only did what he had to. He was trying to save the person he loved most in the world. How could you do this to him? At last she turned. Have you ever lost the one person in the world that meant everything to you? Did you watch them die knowing it was your fault? Adrian said nothing. When my father was killed, she continued, looking back at the window. I remember I found it almost painful to breathe. I not just lost my father, it was as if the whole world had died. But somehow I was left behind alone. I just wanted it to end. I was tired. I wanted the pain to stop. If I had the chance, if they hadn't taken me away, if they hadn't locked me up, I would have thrown myself into the falls. She turned and looked at Hadrian once more. Believe me, he's well cared for, at least as much as he will allow. Ivis makes him good meals and he doesn't eat. Can you think of a better place for Rice right now? Adrian's shoulders slumped. His arms fell loose at his sides. Can I at least see him? Medina thought a moment. Yes, but only you, in this present state. He's a danger to anyone else still. I'm not sure he'll hear you. You can visit him in the morning. She leaned over so she could see Amelia. Can you see to it that he has access? Yes, Your Eminence. Good, the Emperor said, then looked at Arista. Now, what is it that you have that can't wait until morning? The Princess of Melanger stood, shifting her feet, folding and refolding her hands. Before her the robe, the tranquil dark blue. She looked at the Empress, then at Hadrian, Amelia, and even Gerald, who stood stiffly just inside the door. When her eyes once more returned to Medina, she said, I think I know how to stop the elves. Adrian had just descended to the third floor, where several people were returning to the rooms. Now that all the shouting had died down, he got a glimpse of Deegan Gond, the ex-leader of the Nationalists, stood in his nightshirt, peering up the steps, both curious and irritated. This was the first time Hadrian had seen the man since the two of them had been released from the dungeon. His neck and nose were narrow and his lips were so thin. They were almost non-existent. There were creases across his brow and lines about his eyes that spoke of a hard life. Adrian could tell by the way he carried his weight and the motions of his body that he felt awkward, lost in his own skin, yet a faraway look in his eyes. 2 days' growth of beard and a plume of hair that hung out of place. If he had to guess, Adrian might have pegged him as a poor poet. He seemed nothing like the descendant of emperors. What's going on up there? Don't ask the passing servant. Someone looking to see the emperor. Sir, it's over now. Gond appeared dubious. This wasn't how Hadron had planned on meeting Gond. Hadron had waited, giving them both time to fully heal. After that he hesitated out of nerves. He wanted their meeting to go well, to be perfect. This was not perfect, but now that they stood face to face, he could hardly walk away. Hello, Mr. Gaunt. I'm Hadrian Blackwater, he said, introducing himself with a bow. Deegan Gaunt greeted him with his nose crinkled up, as if he smelled something bad. He critically observed Hadrian, then frowned. "I thought you'd be taller. I'm sorry," Hadrian apologized. "You're supposed to be my servant, right?" God asked. He began walking around Hadrian, orbiting him in slow, lazy circles, carrying a frown around with him. "Actually, I'm your bodyguard. How much am I expected to pay for this privilege?" "I'm not asking for money." "No, what is it then?" "You want me to make you a duke or something? Is that why you're here?" Boy, people come out of the woodwork when you've got money and power. I guess I mean, I don't even know you, and here you come, begging for privileges before I'm even crowned emperor. It's not like that. You're the heir of Navran. I am the defender of the heir, just like my father before me. It's a tradition. Gon stood slouching, sucking on his teeth for a moment, before jamming his pinky finger into his mouth to struggle with something caught between them. After a few minutes, he gave up. "Okay, here's what I don't get. I'm the heir. That makes me head of the empire and head of the church. I'm even part god, if I get that right. Great-great-grandson of Marabora. Some kind of witch or weather. So if I'm gonna be emperor and have a whole castle of guards and an army to protect me, what do I need you for?" Hadrian didn't say anything. He didn't know what he could say. God was right. Israel as bodyguard was only important so long as the heir was in hiding. Well, guarding you is sort of a family tradition that I would hate to break, he finally told God. The word sounded silly even to him. "You any good with a sword?" "Pretty good." Gon scratched his stubbly chin. "Well, since you aren't charging anything, I guess I'd be stupid not to take you on." "Okay, you can be my servant, bodyguard, whatever." Gaunt waved at him as if shooing away a pesky fly. "I'm going back to bed. You can wait outside my door and do your guard thing, if you like." Gaunt returned to his room and Hadrian waited outside, feeling decidedly foolish. That had not gone as well as he had hoped. He failed to impress Gaunt, and he had to admit Gaunt did nothing to impress him. He didn't know what exactly he had expected. Maybe he thought Gaunt would be the embodiment of the noble, poor man of staggering integrity, a beacon of enlightenment would grow out of the earth. Sultan struggled to the pinnacle. Sure, his standards were high, but after all, Deegan was supposed to be part god. Instead, just being near him made Hadrian want to go bathe. He leaned against the wall outside the door, looking up and down the quiet hallway. "This is ridiculous. What am I doing?" The answer was obvious. Nothing. But there was nothing to do. He had missed his opportunity and was now useless from somewhere inside. He heard Gaunt begin to snore. The next morning, Hadrian found Royce sitting on the floor of the cell, his back resting against the wall, one knee up cocked like a tent pole. His right arm rested on it, his hand hanging limp. He wore only his black tunic and pants. His belt and boots were missing. His feet bare, the soles blackened with dirt. He hung his head back, tilted upward, resting against the wall, and revealing a week's worth of dark stubble that covered his chin, cheeks, and neck. Lengths of straw littered his hair and clothing, but on his lap lay a neatly folded, meticulously clean scarf. He didn't look up when Hadrian entered the cell. He wasn't sleeping. No one could get this close to Royce without his waking, but more obviously his eyes were open. He stared at the ceiling, not seeing it. "Hey, buddy," Hadrian said, entering the cell. The guard closed the door behind him. He heard the lock slide in place. "Call me when you want out," he told Hadrian. The cell had a small window near the ceiling, which cast a square of light with a wall and floor mat. Through its shaft, he could see strawdust lingering in the air. A cup of water, a glass of wine, and a plate of potato and carrot stew sat beside the door, all untouched, the stew having dried into a solid brick. "Am I interrupting breakfast?" "That was dinner," Roy said. "That bad, huh?" Adrian sat across from him on the bed. It had a thick mattress, a half-dozen warm blankets, 3 soft pillows, and fine linen sheets. It had not been slept in. Not too bad in here, he said, making a show of looking around. We've been a much worse, but, you know, this was pretty much the last place I was thinking you'd be. I sort of thought the idea was for you to disappear and give me time to explain why you kidnapped the Empress. What happened? I turned myself in. Adrian smoked. Obviously. Why are you here? Royce replied, his eyes dull and empty. Well, now that I know you're here, I thought you could use some company. You know, someone to talk to. Someone who can smuggle you fig, pudding, and the occasional drumstick. I could bring up a deck of cards. You know how much you love beating me at. Well, you just like beating me. Royce made an expression that was almost like a smile. He reached out with his left hand and grabbed up a handful of straw. He crushed it in his fist, letting the bits fall through his fingers and watching them in the shaft of light. When the last of it fell, he opened his hand palm up, stared at it, turned it over and back, as if he had never really seen it before. I want to thank you, Adrian, he said, still looking at his hand. His voice soft, lingering, disconnected. Awfully formal, aren't you? It's just a card game, Adrian said and smiled. Royce lowered his hand, laying it on the floor like a forgotten toy. His attention turned vaguely toward the ceiling again. I hated you when we first met. Did you know that? I thought Arcadius was crazy, making me take you along on that heist. So why did you? Honestly, I expected you be killed then. I could go to the nutty wizard, laugh, and say, see, what did I tell you? The clumsy fool died. Only you didn't. You made it all the way to the top of the crown tower. No complaining, no whining. Did you respect me then? No, I figured you suffered from beginner's luck. I expected you die on the return trip that next night, when he made us put it back. Only again I lived. Kind of made me mad, actually. I'm not usually wrong, you know, about people. And man, could you fight. I thought Arcadius was feeding me a load of crap. The way he went on about you, the best warrior alive, he said. In a fair fight, Adrian can best anyone. He said, that was the telling part, a fair fight. He knew not all your battles would be fair. He wanted me to educate you in the world of backstabbing, deceit, and treachery. I guess he figured I knew something about that, and I was supposed to teach honor, decency, and kindness to a man raised by wolves. Royce rolled his head to the side and looked at him. He tells you about me. Not everything, just some of the ugly parts, man's, and just that you were there. That it almost killed you, and that he got you out. Royce nodded. His face drooped, his eyes stared again. His hand absently scooped up another handful of straw to crush. Agent's eyes drifted around the cell. Centuries of captives had left a dark smoothness to all the stones. A bit higher than halfway up, like a flood line. On the far wall, a year's worth of old hatch marks scratched a pattern that looked like a series of bound bales of wheat. Open the window, a bird had built a nest, tucked on the outside corner of the sill. It was empty, frosted in snow. Occasionally heard a cart, a horse, or the sound of people in the courtyard below them, but mostly it was quiet, a heavy, dull gray silence. Adrian, Royce began. He stopped playing with the straw, his hands flat, his stare focused on the wall. His voice weak and hesitant. You and Arcadius, you're the only family I've ever known, the only two people in this whole world. He swallowed and bit his lower lip, pausing. Adrian waited. Finally he went on. I want you to know, it's important that he turned away from Hadrian, facing the war. I wanted to say thank you for being there for me, for being here, for being the closest thing to a brother I'll ever know. I just want you to know that. Agent didn't say anything. He waited for Royce to turn back to look at him. It took several minutes, but the silence drew the look. When he did, Hadrian glared at him. Why? Why do you want me to know that? What do you mean? Tell me no. Don't look at the wall, look at me. Why is it so important that I know this? It just is okay. Royce said no, it's not okay. Don't give me this crap, Royce. We've been together for 12 years. We've faced death dozens of times. Why is it you're telling me this now? I'm upset, I'm distraught. What do you want from me? Adrian continued to stare, but slowly began to nod. You've been waiting, haven't you? Just sitting here leaning against that wall waiting for me to show up. In case you forgot, they arrested me. I'm in a locked cell, there's not much else I can do. Adrian snorted. What? Adrian stood. He needed to move. There wasn't much space. But he still paced back and forth between the wall and the door. 3 steps each way. So when are you going to do it? As soon as I leave tonight. How about a nice morning suicide? All right, you could be poetic and time it with the rising of the sun. Or just the drama of midnight, how would that be? Roy scowled. How you gonna do it, your wrists? Throat gonna challenge the guard to fight? When he brings dinner, call him names? Or are you gonna make an even bigger splash, head for Medina's room, and threaten the Empress's life again? You'll find some young idiot, a big one, some with an ego. You'll draw a blade, something little, something not too scary, you'll draw his sword. You'll pretend to attack, but he won't know you're faking. Don't be this way, this way. Adrian stopped and whirled on him. He had to take a breath to calm down. How do you expect me to be? You think I should be what? Happy maybe? Did you think I'd just be okay with this? I thought you were stronger. If anyone could survive, that's just it. I don't want to, I've always survived. Life is like a bully that gets laughs. By seeing how much humiliation you'll put up with. It threatens to kill you if you don't eat mud. It takes everything you care about. Not because it wants what you have or needs it. It does it just to see if you will take it. I let it push me around ever since I was a kid. I did everything it demanded just to survive. But as I've gotten older, I realize there are limits. You showed me that there's only so far I can go. Only so much I can put up with. I'm not going to take it anymore. I won't eat MUD just to survive, so it's my fault. Adrian slumped down on the mattress once more. He sat there, running his hand through his hair for a moment, then said, "Just so you know, you're not the only one who misses her. I loved her too." Voice looked up. Not like that. You know what I mean. Worst part is, his voice cracked. It really is my fault. And that's what I will be left with. Did you think of that? You were right and I was wrong. You said not to take the job from the wit, but I talked you into it. Let's leave Daldrin. This is not a fight, you said, but I got you to stay. You can't win against Merrick. You said so, you went to protect me. You told me Deegan gone would be an ass, and you were right about that too. You didn't do what you knew was right, because of me. I pulled you along while trying to redeem myself. To the memory of a dead father, Gwen is gone because of me. I destroyed what little good there was in your life, trying to accomplish something that in the end means nothing. I'm not the hero who saves the kingdom and wins. The girl, life isn't like that. Adrian laughed bitterly. You finally taught me that, one pal. Yep, life isn't a fairy tale. Heroes don't ride white. Horses and the good don't always win. I guess I just wanted it to be that way. I didn't think there was any harm in believing it. I never knew it would be you and Gwen that would pay. It's not your fault. Royce told him. You tell me that few million more times, and I might actually stop believing it. Only that's not going to happen now. Is it you're not going to be around to remind me? Are you're gonna give up? You're gonna walk out on me, and that will be my fault too. Damn it, Royce, you have a choice. I know it doesn't seem like it. And I know I'm a fool that believes in a fantasy world where good things can happen to good people, But I do know this. You could either head into darkness and despair, or into virtue and light. It's up to you." Royce jacked his head up and looked at Adrian, a shocked expression on his face. Shark turned quickly to suspicion, but Adrian asked concerned, "How are you doing that?" Royce demanded, and for the first time since Adrian had entered the cell, he saw the old Royce cold, dark, and angry. "How am I doing what?" "That's the second time you've quoted Gwen. Once on the bridge, and now this. She said that same thing to me once. Those exact words. Huh, she read my palm and told me there was a fork, a point of decision. I had to choose to head into darkness and despair, or into virtue and light, she told me. This would be precipitated by a traumatic event. The death of the one I loved the most, Gwen." He nodded. "But you weren't there. You couldn't have heard her say that. We were alone in her office at the house. It was a year ago. I only remember because it was the night Arista came to the Rose and Thorn, and you were getting drunk and ranting about being a parasite. So how did you know?" Adrian shrugged. "I didn't, but he felt a chill run up his spine. What if she did? What if I'm not quoting her? What if she was quoting me? What? When was the seer?" Adrian said. "What if she saw your future bits and pieces? Like Venerlanu did in that Tenkan village." Now he was staring at the wall, his eyes wandering aimlessly as he thought, "She could have seen us on the bridge. And here in this cell she knew what I would say. And she also knew you wouldn't listen to me. She must have known. You wouldn't listen to me at the bridge either. That's why she said those things." He was speaking quickly now, seeing it all before him. "She knew you would ignore me, but you can't ignore her, Royce. Gwen doesn't want you to die. She agrees with me. I may have been wrong in the past, but not this time. This time I'm right. And I know I'm right because Gwen saw the future, and she's backing me up." He sat against the wall, folding his hands behind his head in victory. "You can't kill yourself," he said jubilantly, as if he had just won some unspoken bet. "You can't do it without betraying her wishes." Royce looked confused. "But if she knew, why didn't she stop it? Why did she let me go with you? Why didn't she tell me? It's obvious, isn't it? She wanted us to go. And either she couldn't avoid her death or—" "Oh, what? She wanted to die," he said sarcastically. "No, I was going to say she knew she had to die. Why? I don't know, something else she saw. Maybe something that hasn't happened yet. Something so important. It was worth dying on the bridge for, or whatever it is. It doesn't include you killing yourself. She made that pretty clear, I think." Royce threw his head back against the stone wall, hard enough to make an audible thud, and clenched his eyes shut. "Damn it." Marvin Pickering stood on the fourth-floor balcony, looking out at the palace courtyard. It was snowing again, thick, wet flakes. They fell on the muddy earth, slowly filling in where carts had left deep ruts. One after another the flakes hit the ground and melted. But somehow they managed to overcome. The puddles receded, the dirt disappeared. The world turned white and pure once more. Beyond the walls, he could see the roofs of the city Equester. Stretched out before him, hundreds of snow-covered, thatched peaks clustered together, huddling against the winter storm. The buildings ran to the sea and up the hill north. His gaze rose to the gap he knew was Imperial Square, and farther out to Bingham Square, where he could see the top of the Tradesman's Tower, marking the artisan district. He continued to look up, his gaze reaching out, beyond the open patches of farm fields, to the forested hills, a hazy gray line in the distance, and the suggestion of higher hills beyond. Masked by the snowy curtain, he imagined he could see Gloucester, and beyond it across the river Maylonger, the kingdom of the falcon-crested kings, the land of his birth, his home. Drondel fields would be blanketed in snow, the orchard frosted, the moat frozen. Vern would be out breaking the ice on the well. dropping his heavy hammer tied to the end of a rope. He would be fearful the knot would come loose, like it had 5 years earlier. Leaving his favorite tool at the bottom of the well, it was still there, Marvin thought. Still lying in the water waiting for Vern to claim it. But now he never would. You'll catch your death out there, his mother said. He turned to see her. Standing in the doorway in her dark blue gown, the closest thing she had to black. Around her shoulders was the burgundy shawl Fannin had given her for wintertide, 3 years before the year he died. It became a permanent part of her attire that she wore year-round, explaining how it kept the chill away in the winter and the sun off her shoulders in the summer. That morning, he noticed she was also wearing the necklace. The awkward thick chain, weighed down by the huge pendant, was hard to miss. It was supposed to look like the sun, a big emerald pressed into the gold setting, and lines of rubies forming the rays of light. It was an ugly, gaudy thing. He had seen it only a few times before. In the bottom of a jewelry box. It had been a gift from his father, even after bearing for children. Belinda Pickering still turned heads, too many for his father's comfort. If the stories were true, rumors had circulated for decades of the numerous jewels fought over her honor. Legend asserted there were as many as 20, all sparked by some man looking at her too long. They all ended the same, with the death of the offender of the account. Pickering's magic sword, that was the legend. But more than you of only the actual incidents, the first had occurred before he was born. His father had told him the story on his 13th birthday, the day he had mastered the first tear of the tech chin. His father explained that he and Marvin's mother had been traveling home alone and were waylaid by high women there had been for bandits, and his father was willing to give up their horses, his purse, and even Belinda's jewelry to escape without incident. But his father had seen the way the thieves looked at Belinda. As they whispered back and forth, he saw the hunger in their eyes. His father killed 2, wounded 1, and sent the last one running. They had given his father a scar nearly a foot long. The second had happened when Marvin was just 10. They'd come to Equester for wintertide, and the Earl of Tremor became angry when Kent Pickering refused to enter the sword competition. The Earl knew that even if he had won the tournament, he would still be considered second best. So he challenged Pickering to a duel. Marvin's father refused. The Earl of Tremor had grabbed Belinda and kissed her. Before the entire court, Cheese slapped him and pulled away. When he made a grab for her, he tore free the neckline of her gown. Exposing her, she fell to the floor crying. Struggling to cover herself, Marvin remembered with perfect clarity as father drawing his sword and telling him to help his mother back to their room. He did not kill the Earl of Tremor, but the man lost a hand in the battle. Still, it was easy to see how the story spread, even if he could see how lovely his mother was, only now for the first time did he notice the gray in her hair and the lines on her face. She'd always stood so straight and tall, but now she leaned forward, bowed as if by an invisible weight. "I haven't seen you much," she said. "Where have you been?" "Nowhere." He waited for her to press, to demand more information. He expected it, but she just nodded. His mother had been acting this way since arriving, and it unnerved him. Chancellor Nimbus was by earlier. "He wanted to let you know that the Empress is calling a meeting this evening, and you are requested to attend." "I know, or Rick already told me." "Did he say what it was about?" "It'll be about the invasion. I'm sure she will want to mount a full-scale retaliation. Ulrich expects she will use this crisis to demand Melanger join the Empire." "What will Ulrich do? What can he do?" "Ulrich isn't a king without a kingdom. I should warn you that I intend to join him. I will gather what men Ulrich still has, Form a troop and volunteer to fight. Once more the quiet, submissive nod. Why do you do that? Why must you give in to me without even a protest? If I had said I was going off to war a month ago, I would have never heard the end of it. A month ago you were my son. Today you are Count Pickering. He watched her clutch the shore with a white-knuckled fist. A mouth set her other hand holding the door frame. Maybe he survived. Morven said he's gotten through tough situations before. There's a chance. He could have fought his way out with his sword. No one could ever beat him, not even Braga. Her lips trembled, her eyes grew glassy. Calm, she said, and disappeared back into the castle. He followed as she led the way to her chambers. There were 3 beds in the room, with all the refugees. Space was tight in the palace these days. The chamberlain did his best to accommodate them, according to rang, but there was only so much he could do. Marvin bunked with Ulrich, and now his brother, Danik as well. Marvin knew his mother shared her room with his sister, Linaire, and a Lady Elenda Lenniclin of Glouceston, neither of whom was there at that moment. The room was a fraction of the size of her bed chamber. Back home the beds themselves were small, single bunks. The plain headboards were dressed with quilts, adorned with patterns of roses. Leaded glass windows let the light in. But sheer, white curtains turned the brilliance into a muted fog, which felt heavy and oppressive. The room had the air of a funeral. On the dresser, he spotted the familiar statuette of Navran that used to be in their chapel. The demigods sat upon his throne, one hand upraised in a gesture of authority. Beside it was a single salafan candle still burning. On the floor before it lay her bed pillow, to dance side by side where she had knelt. His mother walked to the wardrobe and withdrew a long, blanket-wrapped bundle. She turned and held it out. There was a formality in her movement, a solemnness in her eyes. He looked at the bundle, long and thin, tied with a green silk ribbon, the kind she and Linaire used to bind their hair. The blanket it held was like a shroud over a dead body. Marvin did not want to touch it. No, he said without meaning to, and took a step backward. Take it. She told him. The door opened abruptly. I don't want to go alone. Elenda Lenniclin said that she and his sister, Linaire, entered. The 2 women were also dressed in dark, conservative gowns. Linaire carried a plate of food and a lender cup. It's awkward, I don't even know him, though. They both stopped. Marvin hastily took the bundle from his mother. He did not look at it and quickly moved toward the door. I'm sorry, Belinda said. She was staring at him, her face troubled. Excuse me, ladies, Marvin muttered and walked past them. He felt his eyes focused on the floor as he went. Marvin, Belinda called down the hallway. He heard her steps behind him and stopped, but he did not turn. She felt her touch his hand. I'm sorry you said that. That was for interrupting. He felt her press against him and she kissed his cheek. Thank you. He watched as she worked hard to force a smile, even as a tear slipped down her cheek. Your mother hasn't eaten. She hardly even leaves the room. Linaire and I went to get her something. That's very kind. Are you all right? I should be asking you that. I lost a father. But you lost a father and 2 brothers as well. She nodded and sniffled. I've been trying not to think about it. There's so much, too much. Everyone has lost someone. You can't have a conversation anymore without people crying their eyes out. She half laughed, half cried, see. He reached up and wiped her tears. Her cheeks were amazingly soft. The wetness made them shine. What were you and Linaire talking about? He asked. Oh, that, she said, sounding embarrassed. It will sound foolish. Perhaps foolishness is needed right now. He made a face and winked at her. She smiled, this time more easily. Come on, he said, taking her hand and pulling her with him down the hall. Tell me this terrible secret. It's not a secret, I just wanted Lynette to come with me. When I meet my brother, Myron, She nodded. I'm a little nervous about it. Frightened, actually. How do I explain why I never bothered to see him? Why didn't you? She shrugged self-consciously. I should have. He was a stranger. If only my father had taken me, but he didn't. He seems like he wanted to forget Myron existed. I think he was ashamed of him, and some of that rubbed off on me, I guess. And now I'm scared. Scared of what? Of him. You're scared of Myron. He started to chuckle, but he stopped abruptly. When he saw the seriousness in her eyes, I knew you'd think me foolish. It's just that we're talking about Myron, and he's the Marquis now, she exclaimed. He's the head of my house. By law, I have to do as he says. Go hurry orders, marry whom he chooses. What if he hates me? What if he decides to punish me for the hardships he has had to endure? I've lived in a castle with servants who dressed, fed and bathed me. I've attended feasts and tournaments, galas and picnics. I've worn silk lace, finely embroidered gowns and jewelry while she stopped. Since the age of 4, Myron has been sequestered at the Wines Abbey. He has been forced to work with his hands in the dirt, won coarse wool, and never gone anywhere or seen anyone. Not even his family. Now they're all dead except for me. Of course he hates me. Why wouldn't he? He'll curse me, and I'll be the target of all his pain and frustration. He'll deny me just as we denied him. You'll send me away, strip me of my title, and leave me penniless, and then I can't even blame him. She looked up at Marvin's face, confused. What? Chapter 4. Fall the Wall. How is Royce? Arista asked Adrian, as they took seats next to each other. Near the end of the table, there were no place cards, and Adrian had no clue where they might want him to sit. He looked to the princess for guidance, but all she offered was a shrug. Not great, but who is these days? He glanced at Ulrich, who was taking a seat across from Arista, then at Marvin, who sat next to his king. Oh, sorry to hear about your father, he offered. Marvin replied with an almost imperceptible nod. Arista stood, reached across the table, and took Marvin's hand. She didn't say a word, but merely looked into his eyes, offering a weak smile. See, that's the difference, Marvin said. I suffer a loss and people console me. Royce suffers a loss and whole towns evacuate. He offered a sad smile. I'm fine, really. My father led a good life. Married the most beautiful woman in the realm, raised 4 children, outlived one, and died in battle defending his home. I should hope to do half as well. It's hard to imagine that anyone could break through Royce's shell, King Ulrich said. Only a few years had passed since Hadrian had first met Ulrich. Royce, and later Myron, spent 3 days roaming the hills of Malanga with the prince just after King Amroth's death. It seems like only yesterday, but Ulrich appeared decades older. His eyes showed the maturity, and his boyish face was gone, hidden behind a full beard. He looked more like his father now, brooding and withered. The small white scar on his forehead was still there, the ghostly reminder of that day. He nearly died when his face was pushed into the dirt. She was a remarkable woman, Adrian explained. I wish I had met her, Arista said, sitting back down. You would have liked Gwen. I know she thought highly of you. She was. Adrian paused. Unique. They gathered in the great hall, the largest chamber in the palace. For stone hearts filled the room with warmth and a ruddy orange glow. Above each massive fireplace, arrays of steel shields and glimmering swords were displayed. As a sign of power, 32 banners displaying all the emblems of all the noble houses of Avron hung from the ceiling, and to rows along the length of the room, 5 had been added since the last time Hadrian had sat there. The banners of the House of Lenaclan of Gloucester, the House of Hessel of Burnham, the House of Exeter, the House of Pickering of Galilean, and the gold-crowned falcon on a red field of the House of Essendon of Mailonger, all restored to their rightful places. The table where they waited was the only one in the room. Placed in the center of the hall, it was longer than the bar of the Rose and Thorn, and 9 chairs lined each side. Along with one at the end, this was the same room where Hadrian spent his first feast, masquerading as a noble. He felt as out of place now as he had then, as the room filled with the other invited guests. Each noble, he knew most of the faces that entered. Ahmed, king of Alban, claimed a seat near the head of the table. His son Prince Rudolf, at his right hand, not to be outdone Frederick, king of Golianon, sat across from him. King Vincent of Maragnon chose to sit 2 chairs down from Frederick, making Hadrian wonder if there was an issue. Between the 2 bordering kingdoms, not everyone was a royal. Sir Elgar, Sir Murthus, and Sir Gilbert, as well as Sir Bracton, who wore the gold sash of his new office as Imperial High Marshal, entered together. Stewards began pouring wine, while 7 seats remained open, including the one at the head of the table, where no one dared sit. Adrian took a sip from the goblet before him. And Grimest, that's right, Arista mentioned. "You aren't a wine drinker, are you, Adrian?" Set the goblet back down and continued to stare at it. "It's probably very good," he said. "It just tastes like spoiled grape juice to me. But you have to remember I was raised on Armagill's beer." Hadrian's old tutor, the awkwardly thin Imperial Chancellor Nimbus, entered along with Amelia, the Imperial Secretary, and they took their seats. To the immediate left and right of the table's head, Degengond wandered in, looking lost. He was dressed in an expensive doublet and breeches, with buckle shoes, none of which suited him. Looking at the Erhagen, couldn't help comparing him to the Duchess of Rochelle's pet poodle, which he dressed in tailored vests. Gaunt circled the table 3 times before choosing a lonely seat in the vacant space. 2 up from Morthan and 1 down from Sarelga, both of whom he eyed suspiciously. 2 more men entered. The first he didn't know, a heavy said. Elderly man with a bald head and sagging cheeks. He was dressed in a long, handsomely brocaded coat with large silver buttons, accompanied by a ruffled silk shirt. Following him was a younger, but fatter duplicate of the first. Adrian recognized him as Cosmas Delure, the wealthiest man in Avron, and infamous head of the Black Diamond Thieves Guild. He guessed the other man must be his father, Cornelius Delure, formerly the unofficial head of the Republic of Delgos. 2 chairs left. Several conversations occurred simultaneously. Adrian tried to make sense of them. Tilted heads, knowing smiles, sidelong glances, murmurs, whispers. He could only catch a handful of words here and there. Most often, what he caught were discussions about the Empress. Many of those at the table had seen her only that one night before the final Winter-dyed joust, when she made her brief but dramatic appearance, and once more when they swore fealty after the uprising. This would be the first opportunity for them to have an audience with her. Trumpets blared. All conversations halted, each head turned, and everyone stood as the Empress entered the hall. A remnant's Medina Navronian passed through the arched doorway, looking every inch the daughter of a god. She wore a black gown gorgeously hand-embroidered with a rainbow of colored thread, and adorned with diamonds, rubies, and sapphires around her neck. A starched ruff rose in the shape of a Chilean lily. She wore long sleeves, with wrist ruffs that scalloped her hands. On her ears dangled sparkling earrings, and on her breast lay a necklace of pearl. As she walked along, black velvet mantle, embroidered with the imperial crest, trailed behind her. The days of begging a clerk for dress material were long gone. The woman Hadrian saw before him at the face of Thracewood, but she was not the little girl he had once pulled from the gutter on Capitol Street in Kalnara. She walked tall, her shoulders back, a gaze elevated. She didn't look at anyone nor turn her head prematurely, her sight fixed by the direction she faced, She took her time walking elegantly, in an arc that allowed her train to straighten before she reached the head of the table. Hadrian smiled to himself as he remembered how a madman had once suggested that, to save her from starvation, she should join the roster at the body-bottom brothel. He had responded with the prophetic words, "Something tells me she's not a prostitute." A steward removed the mantle from her shoulders and placed the chair behind her, but the empress did not sit. Hadrian noted a slight stiffening of her posture as she surveyed her guests. He followed her line of sight. Noting the last empty chair, she dressed numbers. "Did you notify the patriarch of my summons?" "I did, Your Eminence," she sighed, then looked upon her subject. "Lords and ladies, forgive me. I will forego customary traditions, my chancellor tells me. There are many formalities I'm expected to follow. However, such things take time, and time is a luxury we can't afford." It was eerie, Hadrian thought, seeing her addressing heads of state as calmly as if she were holding a tea party for children. "As most of you already know, Evran has been invaded. We believe the attack began more than a month ago, but we were uncertain until very recently. The information comes from the refugees fleeing south, and 12 teams of scouts I had sent north, many of whom never returned. Sir Brachton, if you will. Please explain the situation as it now stands." Sir Brechton rose and stood before the assembly, wearing a long black cape over his dress tunic. All eyes turned to him, not just because he was about to speak, but because Sir Brechton was one of those men who commanded attention. There was something in the way he held himself. He managed to appear taller, straighter, and stouter than other men. Brechton made a formal bow to the Empress, then faced the table. While none of the scouts managed to pierce the advanced troops to report on the main body of the Alvan army, what we have learned is unsettling enough. We now believe that at midnight on Wintertide, elements of the Aravan Empire crossed the Midwalden River with a force estimated at over 100,000. They conquered the kingdom of Dunmore. In less than a week, and Glamrander is gone. King Rosward on Wintertide, elements of the Aravan Empire crossed the Midwalden River with a force estimated at over 100,000. They conquered the kingdom of Dunmore. In less than a week, and Glamrander is gone. King Rosward, Queen Frida, and their entire court lost. That the University of Sheridan was burned, and Avenon destroyed. The men at the table shifted with more anxiety. But less was sad. They entered Maylonger next. He told them, and a few heads turned toward Ulrich. Drondel Fields made a last stand, heroically, providing time for as many as possible to escape Sav. The fortress managed to hold out for a day, King Vincent exclaimed. He looked at Ulrich, who nodded solemnly. How can this be? Presumably, on their return trip from the Wintertide celebration. Heads turned left and right, and Hedron heard the words, 100,000 in less than a week, repeated between them. Brexton paused for only a moment before speaking again. The Elvina host continued west, entering unopposed into Ghent. Estimates suggest they conquered it in 8 days. Whether Ghent put up a fight, we don't know. It's been confirmed, however. King Frederick, the Empress addressed the monarch seated to a left. Please repeat what you told us. King Frederick stood up, brushing the folds from his clothes. He was a squat, balding man with a round belly that pressed the limits of the front of his tunic. Not long after the Wintertide holiday, perhaps a few days at most, what you told us. King Frederick stood up, brushing the folds from his clothes. He was a squat, balding man with a round belly that pressed the limits of the front of his tunic. Not long after the Wintertide holiday, perhaps a few days at most, travelers brought news of trouble in Calais. Little stories of gazelle hitting the coast in droves. Brought news of trouble in Calais. Little stories of gazelle hitting the coast in droves. They called it the flood. Hundreds of thousands of the mongrels stormed the cliffs of Gorondal. Are you saying the elves are in league with the gazelle? Cornelius Delor asked. The king shook his head no. They weren't warriors well, some may have been. But the impression I got was that they too were refugees. They were fleeing and running where they could. The Chilean warlords slaughtered many on the eastern coast, but the deluge was so great they couldn't entirely stem the wave. Within a week, bands of gazelle were on the border of Galianan and slipping into the violent hills. We lost all communication with Calais. No more travelers have come out. Frederick took a seat as of this very afternoon. Sir Brecton said we received word that a ship by the name of the Silver Fin was 5 days out of its port, and Kilno when it saw West Barden burning. Beyond it, the captain said he saw another column of smoke rising in the distance, which he guessed to be Dagestan. Why would the elves launch an attack on both the gazelle and us? Why open to fronts? So Elgar asked. It's likely they don't consider either the gazelle or ourselves to be a serious threat, Recht and told them sources report. The elven host is accompanied by scores of dragons who burn everything in their path. Other reports speak of equally disturbing capabilities, such as the ability to control the weather and call down lightning. There are stories of huge monsters that shake the earth, burrowing beasts, lights that blind, and a mist that devours people. All these fairy stories you would have us believe. Bracton Martha's asked giants, monsters, mists, and elves. Who are these scouts' old wives? This brought chuckles from both Elgar and Gilbert, and a smile from Rudolph. They were good men, Sir Martha's, and it does not befit you to speak ill of the courageous dead. I agree for the lives of the man who died. King Aemon said, but seriously, Bracton, a mist that kills people. You make them out to be the sum of all nightmares, as if every tale of boogeyman, ghost, or wraith spills out of the wood across the Midwilden. These are only elves, Aemon said, but seriously, Bracton, a mist that kills people. You make them out to be the sum of all nightmares, as if every tale of boogeyman, ghost, or wraith spills out of the wood across the Midwilden. These are only elves after all. You make them sound like invincible gods. You make them sound like invincible gods, that they came with hardly a warning. Thousands, both beautiful and terrible, they came on brilliant white horses, wearing shining gold and shimmering blue. They came with dragons and whirlwinds and giants made of stone and earth. They came and nothing could stop them. They are coming still, the voice issued from the doorway, and all heads turned, as into the great hall entered an old man. It was hard to say what caught Adrian's eyes first, as so much was startling. The man's hair, which did not begin until well behind his balding forehead, was long enough to reach the back of his knees, and was beyond gray, beyond white, appearing almost purple, like the edges of a rotting potato. His mouth lacked lips, his eyes were without brows, and his cheeks were shriveled. He wore a cascade of glittering purple, gold at his knees, and was beyond gray, beyond white, appearing almost purple, like the edges of a rotting potato. His mouth lacked lips, his eyes were without brows, and his cheeks were shriveled. He wore a cascade of glittering purple, gold and red robes displayed with relish, flaunting it with dramatic sweeps of his arms as he walked using a tall staff. Brilliant blue eyes shifted restlessly around the room, never pausing for too long on any one person. His jaw held taut in an open-mouthed grin, showed a surprising full complement of teeth, his expression a silent laugh. Behind him entered two equally shocking guards. They wore shimmering gold breastplates over top, shirts of vertical red, purple, and yellow stripes, with long cuffs and billowing sleeves. Matching pants plumed out, gathering just below the knee into long, striped stockings. Across their chests, stretching from their shoulders, hung silver braids and tassels of honor. They wore gold helms, with messenger wings that hid their faces. Each held unusual weapons, long halberds with ornately curved blades at both ends, which they held tight to their sides. With one arm straight down and the other high across their chest, the guards halted in perfect unison. Snapping the heels in one audible clack, the old man continued forward. Approaching Medina, he stopped before her, slamming the metal tip of his staff. Down on the stone floor, "Forgive me, Your Eminence," the old man announced in a loud voice, and followed with an elaborate bow, which allowed him the opportunity to further display. He stopped before her, slamming the metal tip of his staff. Down on the stone floor, "Forgive me, Your Eminence," the old man announced in a loud voice, and followed with an elaborate bow, which allowed him the opportunity to further display the grandeur of his robes. My apologies cannot begin to elevate the depth of my sadness, and having failed to arrive at the appointed time. But alas, I was irrevocably detained. I do hope you can forgive a feeble old man. Medina stared at him, her expression blank. She said nothing. The old man waited, shifted his weight, tilting his head from side to side. Medina glanced at Nimbus, Patriarch Nilnev. The Chancellor addressed the old man. Medina stared at him, her expression blank. She said nothing. The old man waited, shifted his weight, tilting his head from side to side. Medina glanced at Nimbus, Patriarch Nilnev. The Chancellor addressed the old man. "If you will please take your seat." The Patriarch looked at Nimbus, then back to Medina with a curious expression. He nodded, walked to the empty chair, clacking his staff with each step, and sat down. Patriarch Nilnev Brekton said, "Can you explain your interruption of King Armin's comments? I was quoting an ancient text. And hello, the Sylvan gods prey on man, they that death does not visit and time does not mar." Nilnev Brekton said, "Can you explain your interruption of King Armin's comments? I was quoting an ancient text. And hello, the Sylvan gods prey on man, they that death does not visit and time does not mar. Firstborn fairy kings, undisputed lords, mankind cowers before thee." He recited the words with reverence, and paused before continuing. "The ancient writings speak clearly of the power of the elves. So much time has passed, so much dust covers the years. Lords, mankind cowers before thee." He recited the words with reverence, and paused before continuing. "The ancient writings speak clearly of the power of the elves. So much time has passed, so much dust covers the years. That man has forgotten the world as it was before the coming of our Lord Navran. Before his sacred birth, the elves ruled all the land. Every fair place, every sunlit hill and green valley, in the world as it was before the coming of our Lord Navran. Before his sacred birth, the elves ruled all the land. Every fair place, every sunlit hill and green valley lay under their dominion. They were firstborn, greatest of the inhabitants of Elan. We forgot because the miracle of Navran made such amnesia possible. Before his coming, the elves were invincible. Forgive me, Your Holiness." Sorelgo spoke up, his voice like the growl of a bear. "But that's allowed a bull. Elves are..." "We forgot because the miracle of Navran made such amnesia possible. Before his coming, the elves were invincible. Forgive me, Your Holiness." Sorelgo spoke up, his voice like the growl of a bear. "But that's allowed a bull. Elves are as weak as women and dumber than cattle. Have you crossed the Ned Walden Solga? Have you seen a true member of the Aravan Empire and dumber than cattle? Have you crossed the Ned Walden Solga? Have you seen a true member of the Aravan Empire? Or are you speaking of the mirror? What's a mirror? A mirror or cause in Kalayan is one of those wretched, vile creatures that's so often used to defile the streets of cities. Throughout Apollodon, those emaciated, loathsome perversions, with pointed ears. Speaking of the mirror, what's a mirror? A mirror or cause in Kalayan is one of those wretched, vile creatures that's so often used to defile the streets of cities. Throughout Apollodon, those emaciated, loathsome perversions, with pointed ears and slanted eyes, who carry a muddy mix of human and elven blood, are abominations. Mirrors are remnants of a conquered people. that have less in common with elves than you do with a goldfish, who carry a muddy mix of human and elven blood. Are abominations, mere remnants of a conquered people, that have less in common with elves than you do with a goldfish. Elf and human cannot coexist. They are mortal enemies by divine providence. The mixing of their blood in a single body has produced a contemptible, walking insult to both Meribur and Pharaoh, and the god's wrath has fallen upon them. You should human cannot coexist. They are mortal enemies by divine providence. The mixing of their blood in a single body has produced a contemptible, walking insult to both Meribur and Pharaoh, and the god's wrath has fallen upon them. You should not presume to look at a mirror and guess at the nature of an elf. Okay, I get the point. Still, I've never come across a creature that draws breath, who is immune from the sharpened tip of a sword. Look at a mirror and guess at the nature of an elf. Okay, I get the point. Still, I've never come across a creature that draws breath, who is immune from the sharpened tip of a sword. Elgar said. This produced pounding of fists on the table, and grants of agreement from the other knights, all except Bracton. The ancient text tells us that, prior to the coming of Navran, no elf was ever killed by a man. Moreover, due to their long life, no human ever saw an elven corpse. This gave rise to the belief that they were the mortal gods, soft of foot, loud as thunder, terrible as lightning, greater than the stars. They come. Moreover, due to their long life, no human ever saw an elven corpse. This gave rise to the belief that they were the mortal gods, soft of foot, loud as thunder, terrible as lightning, greater than the stars. They come to conquer. So if they were so great, how did Navran stop them? Ilga challenged. He was the son of a god. The patriarch replied simply, and he paused briefly, his grin widening to display even more teeth. He had help in the form of the Relican, the divine sword, so Bracton asked skeptically. The patriarch shook his head. It was created by the gods. But the Relican is not a soul. It is the trumpet of Pharaoh, the call of nations, the Shirduagai Lindora, that Navran used to defeat the Aravan nation. Many make the same mistake. In the old speech, the word sword means horn, but that bit of information was lost when some sloppy translator thought it meant sword. The name Relicon is merely old speech for relic or artifact, so the sword Duagai, Lindora, or horn of Glindora became the sword, but that bit of information was lost when some sloppy translator thought it meant sword. The name Relicon is merely old speech for relic or artifact, so the sword Duagai, Lindora, or horn of Glindora became the sword that is a great relic, or the Relicon, or the Relicon. The weapon that Navran used against the elves. How can this horn defeat an army? So Bracton asked. It was made by the hand of their god, Pharaoh, and holds dominion over them. It gave Navran the power to defeat the elves. And where might this marvelous trumpet be? Cornelius Delors spoke up. I only ask because in our present circumstances, such a delightful treasure could prove to be and holds dominion over them. It gave Navran the power to defeat the elves. And where might this marvelous trumpet be? Cornelius Delors spoke up. I only ask because in our present circumstances, such a delightful treasure could prove to be quite useful. Herein lies the great question. The Relicon has been lost for centuries. No one knows what became of the horn of Glendora. The best accounts place it in the ancient capital of Persepolis. Just before the city vanished, banished, Cornelius asked, leaning forward as far as his immense girth would allow. Yes, the patriarch said. All accounts from that time report that. The city was there one day, and gone the next. Persepolis was consumed. Lost, it is said, in a single day. The patriarch closed his eyes and spoke in a musical tone. Navran's home seat of power. White roads, walls, roofs and towers upon 3 hills, fair and tall. Gone forever, for the wall, birthplace of our wondrous queen. Mounted flags of blue and green, exquisite mansions, Wondrous Hall's goodbye forever for the wall. City of Persepliques ever sought, forever missed pick and shovel. Diggin' Hall search forever for the wall. Gala halted city's doom. Spring warmth chilled with dust and gloom. Darkness sealed blankets, all death upon them, all the wall. Ancient stones upon the lea. Dusts of memories gone we see once the center. Once the all lost forever for the wall. I know that Adrian blurted out, and regretted it the moment he did, as all death upon them, all the wall. Ancient stones upon the lea. Dusts of memories gone we see once the center. Once the all lost forever for the wall. I know that Adrian blurted out, and regretted it the moment he did, as all eyes looked his way. It's just that I remember hearing that as a kid. Not the whole thing, just the last part, eh? It's just that I remember hearing that as a kid. Not the whole thing, just the last part. We used to sing it when we played the game called Fall the Wall. We didn't know what it meant. We didn't think it meant anything, although some of the kids thought it had something to do with the runes of Amberton Lee. It does. Arista broke in. Amberton Lee is all that remains of the ancient capital of Perse. Didn't know what it meant. We didn't think it meant anything, although some of the kids thought it had something to do with the runes of Amberton Lee. It does. Arista broke in. Amberton Lee is all that remains of the ancient capital of Persepliques. Agent heard the reactions of disbelief around the table. How do you know this? Samarthas asked inquisitorially. Agent heard the reactions of disbelief around the table. How do you know this? Samarthas asked inquisitorially. Scholars and adventurers have searched for centuries, and a wit he got himself. A princess just happens to know where it is. What proof do you have? I had. Arista began when the Empress cut her off. Princess Arista has provided to me. Adventurers have searched for centuries, and a wit he got himself. A princess just happens to know where it is. What proof do you have? I had. Arista began when the Empress cut her off. Princess Arista has provided to me irrefutable proof that what she says is indeed true. Medina glared at the knight. Samarthos looked as if he might protest, but he closed his mouth in defeat. I believe the city is buried, that what she says is indeed true. Medina glared at the knight. Samarthos looked as if he might protest, but he closed his mouth in defeat. I believe the city is buried. Arista went on. I think Edmund Hall found a way in. If only we had his journal. But the crown tower is gone along with everything in it. Wait a minute, Pedrian said. Was it a beat-up brown leather notebook about this big? He gestured with his hands. Yes, the patriarch said. Arista looked back and forth between them. How do you know that? I know it because I have lived in the crown tower, the patriarch said. And you? Arista looked at Hadron, who hesitated. Haha, of course I knew it. Cosmus Delor chuckled and clapped his hands together in single applause, while smiling at Hadrian. Such a wonderfully delightful rumor. As that has to be true, that is an exquisite accomplishment. You stole it, Arist asked. Yes, he did. The patriarch declared. Actually, Adrian said, Royce and I did. But we put it back the next night. Rera's reputation is well-founded. Cosmo said, I did not wish to lose such an important treasure again. So since then I've kept it with me at all times. The patriarch pulled out a small, ruddy brown leather book and lay it on the table. This is the journal of Edmund Hall, the daily account of his descent into the ancient city of Persepliques and what lies within. Everyone stared at the book for a moment in silence. The princess is correct. The patriarch continued. The city lies beneath Amberton. Leon Hall did find a means in. He also found a great deal more than that. The journal speaks of a terrible shaft of darkness, an underground sea that must be crossed insidiously, complex tunnels and tight crevasses. Bloodthirsty tribes of Baron, Gazelle and amongst are so terrible. All could not fully describe it. You're saying the ancient capital is only 3 miles from Hinton? Adrian asked. Yes, Medina said, and I plan on sending in a party to retrieve this horn. Having read Hall's journal, the patriarch said, I believe you will need several skilled warriors. Someone with historical knowledge of the city, someone with splunking skills, and someone with sailing experience. I've already sent 3 teams on this very mission. Perhaps I know the Emperor said they all failed. Princess Arista will organize my team. If we could borrow Hall's journal, Arista said that would be of great assistance. I promise you'll have it returned before the party sets out. The Patriarch's smile seemed to waver, but he nodded. Of course, it is the least I can do. Medina gestured toward Arista. Your Highness, if you will. The princess stood up and faced the table. Before she could talk, however, Saraga got to his feet. Hold on. He said, are you saying we aren't even going to try and fight them? We're just going to sit here and wait for some fairy tale horn that might not even exist anymore. I say we form ranks, march north and hit them before they hit us. Your courage is commendable. So Brecton said, but in this instance foolish. We have no idea where our enemy is, the size or strength of their force, or their path of movement, without even the faintest hint about our enemy. We would be as a blind man, fumbling around for a bear in the forest. All attempts to discover anything about our foe have met with failure. I have sent dozens of scouts and few have returned. It seems wrong to just wait. We won't just be waiting, the Emperor said. You can be assured that Sir Brecton has drawn up excellent plans for the defense of Aquesta, which I expect each of you to support. We have already begun overstocking the city with supplies and reinforcing the walls. We should not deceive ourselves. This war, the storm, is coming, and we must be prepared for it. I assure you we will stand. We will fight and we will pray. As I find myself faced with annihilation, I am not above throwing support to even the thinnest promise, if there is a chance that finding this horn can save my people, my family. We must try. I will do whatever it takes to protect us. I would even make a deal with Uberland himself, if that is what is needed. When she was done, no one said a word, until she once more gestured toward Arista. The princess took a breath. I've already discussed this with the Empress. The team will be small, no more than 12. I think 2 people must go. For the rest, I will ask for volunteers, starting from a list we've already prepared. I will speak with those on the list individually, in order to allow for the privacy of each person's decision. And who are these 2? Mirthas asked. The ones that must go. Can we know their names? Yes, Arista said. They are Deegan Gond and myself. Several people spoke at once. Sorelger and the other knights laughed, and Alaric started to protest, but by far the loudest voice in the room came from Deegan Gond. Are you insane? He shouted, jumping to his feet. I'm not going anywhere. Why do I have to go? This is just another plot of the aristocracy to silence me. Can't you see what this really is? This elven threat is a hoax, an excuse to oppress the common man once more. Sit down, Mr. Gaunt, Medina said. We'll discuss this in private, as soon as the meeting is over. Gaunt dubiously sat down and slumped in his chair. The Empress rose and the room went silent. This concludes this meeting. Sir Brecton will begin by convening a war council here in 1 hour to specify in detail the reorganization of troops and the requisition of supplies and arms necessary to develop a proper defense for the city. Those not asked to join the Presepoquis party should meet back here at that time. In the future, Chancellor Nimbus' son, Secretary Amelia, will be on hand in their offices to answer any additional questions. May Maribor protect us all. The room filled with the sounds of scraping chairs and low conversations. Adrian rose to his feet, but stopped when he felt Arista's hand on his arm. We stay here, she told him. He glanced up the length of the table. As the kings and knights began filing out of the room, the Empress made no indication of leaving. Nor did Amelia or Nimbus even caught the spindling Chancellor subtly patting the table with his hand. as further indication that Hadrian should sit. Back down, Paul, Rick, and Marvin stood, but didn't advance toward the exit. The patriarch, flanked by his bodyguards, exited the hall. He looked back, nodding and smiling, his staff clicking on the stone. It was the last one out of the hall, and with a nod from Nimbus guards closed the doors. A dull but Adrian felt ominous thud echoed with their closing. "I'm going," Eric told his sister. But she started no buds. He said, "Family, you went to meet with God against my wishes. You tried to free him from these dungeons instead of coming home. You even managed to be on hand when Medina flew. The Galara Bryn, I'm tired of being the one sitting home, worrying I may no longer have a kingdom, but I am still the king. If you go, I go." Meta, Marvin put in as Count of Gowlin. "It falls to me to keep both of you safe." "My father would have insisted. I was just going to say before you interrupted." Artist began, "That you're both already on the list. I'll just check you both off." Disagreeing, "Good." Arg smiled triumphantly, folding his arms across his chest, then grinned at Marvin. "Looks like we'll make it to Persepolis after all, and you can take me off your bloody list." Deegan Gaunt shouted. He was on his feet. "I'm not going." "Please sit down, Deegan," Arista told him. "I need to explain." Deegan remained furious, his eyes wide, his hands tugging at his doublet and his tight collar. "You," he pointed at Hadron, "are you just going to sit there? Aren't you supposed to protect me from what?" he asked. The only one to talk, from the British, manhandling of the common man by the rich aristocracy. "That's actually what we need to speak about," Medina explained. "You are the true heir of Navran, not I. That is why Ethelord and Salder locked you up. Then why haven't I been acknowledged? I've seen precious little benefit from that. Wondrous title, I should be the emperor. I should be on the throne. Why hasn't my pedigree been announced? Why do you feel it is necessary to speak about my lineage? In private, if I am really this heir, I should be sitting for my coronation right now, not going off on some suicide mission. How stupid do you think I am? If I really were this descendant of a god, I would be too valuable to risk. Oh no. You want me out of the way so you can rule. I am an inconvenience that you have found a convenient way to dispose of. Your lineage hasn't been announced for your own safety. If Gon cut Medina off my own safety, you people are the only ones that threaten me. Will you let her finish?" Amelia told him. Medina patted her hand, then continued. "The heir has the ability to unite the four nations of Apollodorn under one banner, but I've already accomplished that. Or rather, the late Regent Salder and Ethered have, through their diligent, misguided efforts. The world already believes the heir sits on the imperial throne. At this moment we are in a war with an adversary we have little chance of defeating. This is no time to shake the people's belief. They must remain strong and confident that the heir already rules. We must remain united in the face of our enemy. If we revealed the truth now, that confidence would be shaken and our strength destroyed. If we manage to survive, if we live to see the snow melt and the flowers bloom again, then you and I can talk about who sits on the throne." Deegan stood with less conviction now. He leaned on the table, pulling on his collar. "I still don't see why I need to go on this loony trip into a buried city. The ability to unite the kingdoms was thought to be the sum of the heir's value, but we now believe it is trivial compared to your true importance, and that is your ability to both find and use the Horn of Glendora. But I don't know anything about this. This pawn thingy, what is it I'm supposed to do exactly? I don't know what will happen if I use it. I don't know, then I don't know that I'm going. You said that if everything works out, we'll talk about who sits on the imperial throne. But I say we have that discussion now. I'll go on this quest of yours. But in return I demand the throne I wanted, in writing signed with your hand. Then I will be Emperor of Peladon upon my return, regardless of success. and I wanted copies, one of which I will take with me. In case the other is somehow lost. That's outrageous, all right, declared. Perhaps, but I won't go otherwise. Oh, you go, Marvin assured him with a smirk. Sure, you could tie me up and drag me, but I'll hang limp a dead weight. That will slow you down. But at some point you'll need me to do something, which I assure you I will not. So if you want my cooperation, you will give me the throne. Medina stared at him. All right, she said. If that is your price, I will pay it. You're not serious, Barak exclaimed. You can't agree to put this careful. Gon said you are speaking of your next emperor. And I remember slight against me. What will happen to Medina? Amelia asked. Gaunt burst his lips, considering she was a farmer once. Wasn't she? She can go back to that. Empress, all right. Began, think about what you're doing. I am. She turned to Nimbus. Take Gaunt, have the scribe write up whatever he wants. I will sign it. Gaunt smiled broadly and followed the chancellor out of the hall. The silence followed. Balric started to speak several times, but stopped himself and finally slumped in his seat. Arista looked at Hadrian and took his hand. I want you to go. Adrian glanced at the door. Being his bodyguard, I don't suppose I have a choice. She smiled, then added, I also want Royce to come. Adrian ran a hand through his hair. That might be a bit of a problem. He looked toward Medina. I have no objection, she said. We need the best team I can put together. Arista added, that's right, Oryx said. If ever there was a need for my miracle team. This is it, tell him I'll make it worth his time. I still have some fortune left. Adrian shook his head. This time it won't be about money, but you will talk to him, Arista asked. I'll try. Hey, Eric said to Arista. Why is it that you feel compelled to go? I never remember you having any interest in Persepolis before. To be honest, I would rather not go. But it's my responsibility now. Responsibility. Perhaps penance is a better word you could say. I am haunted. Her brother didn't appear to understand, but she did not elaborate. We still need a historian, Fondi Arcadius had. But now, I know someone, Adrian said. Picking up Hall's journal, a friend with an appetite for books and an uncanny memory, Arista nodded. What about someone with sailing experience? Royce and I spent a month on the Emerald Storm. We know a little about ships. It's a shame I don't know where Wyatt de Menthil is, though he was the helmsman on the Storm, and a fantastic seaman. I'm familiar with Mr. de Menthil. Medina said, drawing a curious look from Hadron. I see if I can convince him to sign on. That just leaves the dwarf, Arista said, though what Adrian stared at her. Magnus. You found him, Auric asked. Medina did. That's wonderful, Auric exclaimed. We can execute him before our departure. He's going with you, Medina told him. He killed my father, Auric shouted. He stabbed him in the back while he was at prayer. While I can see your point, Your Majesty, Adrian said to Walric. There's a more pressing issue. He nearly killed Royce twice. If he sees Magnus, the dwarf is dead. Then perhaps you should be the one to hang on to this. Medina produced the white dagger and slid it down the table, where it came to rest, spinning slightly before Hadrian. I know all about Magnus's crimes. His obsession with Royce's dagger caused him to make poor decisions, including the one that got him arrested when he tried to steal it from the storehouse. You're going underground, perhaps deep underground. There'll be no maps or road signs. And I can't afford for you to get lost. Ulrich, Medina and I agree on this. Arista said, remember, he was my father as well. We're setting out on a journey that may decide the fate of our race. The elves don't want to push us from our lands and lock us in slums. They plan to eradicate us. They won't ever let us have a second chance to hurt them. If we don't succeed, it's over. All of it. No more Maylonger, no more Warwick, no more Avron. Will cease to exist if I must tolerate, even forgive, a murderer as payment for the safety of everyone and everything I've ever known. Why, I'd marry the little cretin. if that was the modest price Maribor put on this prize. There was a silence after the princess stopped speaking. "All right," Ulrich said grudgingly, "I guess I can put up with him." Adrian reached out and picked up Alveston. "I will definitely need to hold on to this. Wow." Marvin said, looking at a rooster, "You'd marry him. That's really sick." "Supplies are being prepared," Medina explained. "Food kits designed by Ibis Thinley will be packed, along with lanterns, ropes, harnesses, axes, cloth, pitch, blankets, and everything else we can think of that you might need. Then we will leave as soon as the supplies are ready," Arista declared. "So it's settled." Medina stood and all the others followed suit. May Maribor guide your steps. Chapter 5. The Marquis of Glaston. Myron sat curled up on his bunk, bundled deep in several layers of blankets. He had his hood up and a candle in his hand, which hovered over a giant book spread across his knees. He shared Hadrian's room in the Knights' dormitories. The room lacked a window and fireplace, leaving it dark as well as cold. Only a plain green drape covering one wall interrupted the drab space. Myron didn't mind. He liked the room. He took his meals in the kitchen. Breakfast was early and supper late. Working on Abbey time, he read the Elkan daily and said his prayers alone. In many ways it reminded him of the Abbey. He had expected he would be homesick by now, but the feeling never came. This surprised him at first, but home, he realized, wasn't so much a place as an idea that, like everything else, grew and blossomed along with the person. Being away gave him a new insight, that the Abbey was no longer his home. He carried his home with him now, and his family wasn't just a handful of monks. He forced his eyes to focus on the book before him, Lord and Berlin of Gaston. Lou had just discovered that he was descended from the Earl of Gast, who had defeated the invading Lumbertons in the Battle of Primaton Tor. He had no idea who Lord Amblin was, nor whom the Lumbertons might be. But it was fascinating just the same. Everything he read still fascinated him. A knock at the door caused him to nearly spill the candle. He put the book away, and opening up was greeted by a familiar page. "My lord," Myron smiled. The boy always called them that, and Myron found each instance funny. "The Lady Alyendair requests an audience with you in the small east parlor. She's there now. Will you see her? Or shall I respond with a message?" Myron stood puzzled for a moment. "Lady who? The Lady Alyendair of Glaston? Oh," he said. I'll go, but, could you show me the way that? I don't know where the east parlor is." "Certainly, my lord." The page turned and began walking, leaving Myron to quickly close the door and trot after him. "What is Lady Alinda like?" Myron asked. The page glanced at him surprised. "She is your sister, my lord. At least that is what she said." "Yes, she is. But do you know what she wants?" "No, my lord." "The Lady Alanda did not say. Did she sound angry?" "No, my lord." They reached the small parlor with its hearty fires. Warm glow. The room was filled with many soft, upholstered chairs and couches, lending the chamber a friendly feel. Which tapestry is depicting a hunt, a battle, and a spring festival covered the walls. Two women jumped to their feet the moment he entered. The foremost was dressed in a beautiful black gown of brocade, with a high collar and tight bodice, composed of many buttons, lace, and trimming. The second wore a much simpler, but nonetheless rich black gown of kersey, having spent almost his entire life in a monastery on top of a remote hill. Myron had met few people and even fewer women, and none like these two. They were both as beautiful as a pair of deer. They promptly courtesied, and Myron wasn't sure what that meant. Am I supposed to courtesy as well? Before he could decide, one of them spoke. "My lord," the nearest woman said while still bent down. "I am your sister Alenda, and with me is my maid Emily." "Hello," he said awkwardly. "I'm Myron." He held out his hand. Alender, still in full courtesy, looked up confused. She spotted his outstretched arm. and gave an odd glance to the other woman. Before taking it, she kissed the back of his hand. Myron held his hand back, shocked. A long, uncomfortable silence followed. "I really wish I had some cookies to offer you," he said at length, again silent. "We always had cookies at the Abbey for guests. I want to ask your forgiveness." "Your lordship," Belinda burst out in a quavering voice, "for failing to meet you before this. I know it was wrong of me, and that you have every reason to be angry. I've come now to beg you to be merciful." Myron looked at the woman before him, baffled. He blinked several times. "You are begging mercy from me?" The lender looked at him, horrified. "Oh, please, my lord, have pity. I didn't even know you lived until I was 14, and then I heard about you only in passing. During a dinner conversation. It really wasn't until I was 19 that I fully realized I had another brother, and that father had sentenced you to that awful place. I know I am not blameless. I realize my misdeeds, and fully admit to you my foul nature. When I heard you lived, I should have come at once and embraced you, but I did not. Still, you must understand, I'm not accustomed to traveling abroad and visiting strange men, even if they are my long-lost brother. If only our father had brought me to you, but he refused, and sadly I did not press." Myron stood frozen in place. Looking at him, Belinda wailed, "Sentence me as you must, but please do not torture me any longer. My heart cannot stand it." Myron's mouth opened, but nothing came out. He stepped back, stunned. Belinda stood wavering on, her feet in the silence between them. She looked at the frayed, coarse woolen frock he wore, and her eyes filled with tears. She stepped toward him, her hands shaking. She reached out, touching his garment, letting it play between her fingers, and whispered with a closing throat, "I am sorry for how father treated you. I'm sorry for how I treated you. I'm sorry for all that you have been forced to endure by our selfishness, but please don't turn me out into the cold. I'll do whatever you ask, but please have pity." Belinda fell to her knees before him, weeping into our hands. Myron fell to his own knees and, reaching out, put his arms around his sister and hugged her. "Please stop crying. I don't know what I did to hurt you, but I'm very sorry." He looked up at Emily and mouthed, "Help me." The maid just stared at him in shock. Belinda looked up, dabbing the tears from her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "You aren't going to strip me off my title, drive me off our land, and force me to fend for myself?" "Oh, dear Maribor, no," Myron exclaimed. "I could never do that." "But he won't, of course not. But will you? Could you also grant me my diary of the Rillen Valley?" she said, and then very quickly added, "I only asked because no decent man would ever marry a woman without an adequate diary. Without this, I would continue to be a burden to you and the estate. Of course, the island is very good land, and I understand that you may not want to part with it, but father promised it to me still. I would be happy with anything you are willing to grant, but I can't give you anything. I'm only a monk of the Wines Abbey." He pulled the cloth of his frock out from his chest. "This is all I own. This is all I've ever owned. And technically I think this belongs to the Abbey." But Belinda looked at him, stunned. "Don't you know?" Myron waited, blinking again. "Our father and brothers are all gone, fallen in the battle against the elves. They died at Drondel Fields. I'm so sorry to hear that." Myron said. He patted her hand. "I mourn for your loss. You must feel awful. They were your family as well." "Yes, of course. But I wasn't as close to them as you were. Actually, I only met father then just once. But that doesn't diminish my sympathy for you. I am so sorry for you. Is there anything I can do?" A questioning furrow across her brow, Belinda exchanged looks with Emily. "I'm not sure you understand. With their passing, our family's fortune and title passes to you. They left you your inheritance. You are the Marquis of Gloucester. You own thousands of acres of land, a castle, villages. Barons and knights are all yours to command. You control the lives of hundreds of men and women. Who live or die at your decree. Myron shivered and grimaced. No, no. I'm sorry, you must be mistaken. I want none of that. I don't suppose I could trouble you to take care of those things. So I can have the Ryland Valley. Oh no. Well, I mean yes. I mean everything. I don't want it, you can have it all. Well, are there any books? A few, I think. Elenda said, dazed. Then can I have those? He asked. You can have them back if you want after I read them, but if you don't, I'd like to make them part of the library at Windermere. Would that be all right? Are you saying? You want me to assume ownership of all of Gloucester, everything except the books? Myron nodded and glanced at Emily. If that's too much trouble, perhaps your friend could help. Maybe she could have some of those castles and knights. You know, many hands make light work. Elena nodded with her mouth still open. Myron smiled. Was there anything else? Melinda shook her head slowly. Okay, well, it was very nice meeting you. He reached out and shook Elender's hand. Both of you. He shook Emily's as well. Neither said a word. He exited through the door and leaned with his back against the wall, feeling as if he had just escaped death itself. There you are. Adrian called to him as he approached up the corridor, clutching a small notebook. The page told me you were here. The strangest thing just happened. Myron told him, pointing back at the parlor door. Save it. He held out the book. You need to read this tonight. The whole thing. Can you do that? Just the one. Adrian smiled. I knew I could count on you. What is it? Edmund Hall's journal. Oh my, exactly. And tomorrow you can tell me all about it on the road. It'll help to pass the time. Road tomorrow? Myron asked. Am I going back to the Abbey? Better, you're going to be a hero. Chapter 6. Volunteers, as far as prison cells went. Wyatt de Menthil had seen far worse. Despite the stone, it was surprisingly warm and remarkably similar to the solitary cell he'd been occupying for the past several weeks. The small bed he sat on was nicer than most of the rooms he had rented, and much better than the ship hammocks he was used to. A small window high up allowed light to splash the far wall. Wyatt had to admit it was a fine room. He might have even found it comfortable, if not for the locked door and the dwarf staring at him. The dwarf had already been in the cell when they had brought Wyatt in, and the guards hadn't bothered with introductions. He had a brown braided beard and a broad flat nose, and he was dressed in a blue leather vest with large black boots, despite having been roommates for several hours. Neither Ed said a word. The dwarf grumbled occasionally, shuffled his boots as he shifted position, but said nothing. Instead, he had a nasty habit of staring. Little round eyes peered out from beneath bushy eaves, eyebrows that matched his beard in color, if not in neatness. Wyatt had known few dwarves, but they always sported carefully groomed beards. So you're a sailor, the dwarf muttered. Wyatt, who had been passing the time by playing with the feather in his hat, raised his head and nodded. And you're a dwarf. What was your first clue? The little fellow smacked. What you do? Wyatt didn't see any point in avoiding the question. Lies were told to protect one's future, and why? It had no illusions of his. I am responsible for destroying Total 4. The dwarf sat up, interested. Really, what part? The whole city? Well, technically all of Delgos, if you think about it, I mean. Without the protection of Drumander, the port is lost and the rest is helpless. You destroyed an entire country, pretty much. Wyatt nodded miserably and sighed. The dwarf continued to stare at him, now in fascination. How about you? Wyatt asked. What did you do? I tried to steal a dagger. Now it was Wyatt's turn to stare. Really? Sure, but you have to remember, I'm a dwarf. You'll probably get a slap on the wrist. After all, you only destroyed a country. I likely be ripped apart by wild dogs. The door to the chamber opened, and while Wyatt had never actually seen her before, there was no mistaking Empress Modena Navronian. She entered, flanked by guards and a spindly man in a foppish wig. Both of you are guilty of crimes, she said, punishable by execution. Wyatt was surprised at the sound of her voice. He had expected an icier tone, a shrill superiority common to high nobility. She sounded oddly enough like a young girl, Wyatt Diamondthal. The spindly man and the wig said formally for once, an act that precipitated and enabled the invasion of Delgos and the destruction of Tor Delfor by the Barangazel. You are hereby found guilty of high treason against mankind and this empire. Punishment will be execution by beheading, to be carried out immediately. The Empress then turned to the dwarf, and once more the thin man spoke. Magnus the dwarf, for the murder of King Amrath, you are hereby found guilty and sentenced to death by beheading, also to be carried out at once. Seems you left something out, Wyatt said to the dwarf, who only grumbled in response. Both of your lives are over, Medina said. Then when I leave this room, the headsman will escort you to the block in the courtyard, where your punishment will be administered. Is there anything you would like to say before I leave? My daughter work began. She's innocent, so is Eldon, the big guy with her. I beg you, please don't punish them. They are safe and free to go. But where do you think they will go once you're dead? You've been caring for them both for many years, haven't you? While Eldon may make a fine babysitter, he's not much of a provider, is he? Why are you saying this? It mystified Wyatt that such a young girl could be so cruel. Because I would like to make you an offer. Mr. de Mantle, I would like to make both of you an offer. Given your positions, I think it is a very good one. I want the two of you to do a task for me. It'll involve a difficult journey that I suspect will be very dangerous. If you agree, then upon your return, I shall absolve you both of your crimes. And if I don't come back, what happens to Eldon and Ollie? Eldon will go with you. I need experience, sailors, and strength. I think he'll be useful. What about Ollie? I won't ever going to some prison or orphanage. Can she come as well? No, as I mentioned, the trip will be dangerous, so she will remain with me. I will be her guardian while you are away. What if I don't come back? What if neither Eldon nor I, if that happens? I promise that I will personally adopt her. You will? Yes, Mr. Demeter. If you succeed, you will be forgiven of all crimes you have committed. If you fail, I will make your daughter my daughter. Of course, you can refuse my offer, in which case, I have to ask if you would prefer a blindfold or not. It's your choice. And me, Magnus asked, I offer you the same thing. Do as I ask and you live. I'll consider your service as fulfillment of your sentence. In your case, however, there is one additional stipulation. Mr. de Menthel has proved that his ties to his daughter is strong, enough to hold him to his commitments. You, on the other hand, have no such attachments and have a talent for disappearing. I can't afford to let you out of the cell without some insurance. I know a sorceress who can find anyone, anywhere, using only a strand of hair. And your beard is ever so long. Magnus's eyes widened in alarm. It's your choice, Master Dwarf, your beard or your neck. Do we at least get to know where we're going? And what we'll be doing? White asked. Does it matter? White thought a moment, then shook his head. You'll be accompanying a team to the ancient city of Persepicus to find a very important relic that might just save mankind. If you succeed at that, I think you deserve to be forgiven for any crime. There's just one more thing. You'll be accompanied by Royce Melbourne and Hadrian Blackwater. As for you, Wyatt, they know nothing of your involvement with Merrick. I suggest you keep it that way. Merrick is dead, and nothing good can come from revealing your involvement in Torridal 4. Wyatt nodded toward the dwarf. I already told him that's all right. I doubt Master Magnus will be speaking to them much. Magnus has had, shall we say, his own misunderstandings with Rajera, not to mention the children of King Amra, who will also be along for the trip. I suspect he'll be on his best behavior. Won't you, Magnus? The dwarf's face showed concern. But he nodded. So gentlemen, the choice is yours. Risk your lives for me and have a chance to become heroes of the Empire. Or refuse and die now as criminals. Life's not much of a choice. The dwarf growled. No, it isn't. But it's all you have. Adrian slowly climbed the steps. It felt like there were more of them this time. Aside from speaking to Myron, Adrian has spent all night and a good part of the next day walking the corridors and courtyard, trying to formulate an argument, a reason that would convince Royce to go. The guard heard him coming and was on his feet, key in hand. He looked bored. "You've come to take him?" he asked without interest. "I was told you'd be by. Expected you earlier." Adrian only nodded in reply. So much fuss about this little guy. From hearing the talk around the palace, you'd think he was Ubelin himself. The guard continued as he placed the key in the lock. "He's been quieter than a mouse. A few nights ago I heard him crying, muffled sobs, you know. Not exactly the demon I was warned about." Royce hadn't moved. Nothing in the cell had changed. "Since Hadrian's last visit, you want to give me a minute?" Agent asked the guard who stood behind him. "How sure, take your time." Adrian stood silently at the open door. Royce didn't move. He continued to sit with his head bowed. Adrian sighed after all his searching. His thinking, his wondering, his solution seemed feeble at best. It held dozens of mental debates in which he had played both sides of the argument. But when he sat across from Royce, it only one thing he could say. "I need your help." Royce looked up as if his head weighed 100 pounds. His eyes read his face action. He waited. "One last job." Adrian told him, then added, "I promise." "Is it dangerous?" "Barry, is there a good chance I'll get killed?" "Odds are definitely in favor of that." Royce nodded, looked down at the scarf in his lap and replied, "Okay." Chapter 7. The Laughing Gnome. Arista lugged her pack out into the cold. 3 stewards and 1 soldier, an older man with a dark beard who held the door open, offered to carry it for her. She shook her head and smiled. The pack was light. Gone with the days of bringing 6 silk dresses, hoop skirts, corsets, girdles, and a hairdress just in case. She planned to sleep in the clothes she traveled in, and learn to do without almost everything else. All she really needed was the robe. The wind blew snow in her face, freezing her nose. Her feet felt cold, but the rest of her was immune, protected by the shimmering garment. As she crossed the courtyard, the only light came from within the stable, and the loudest noise from her boots. As they crushed the snow, "Your Highness," a boy chased after her gingerly, holding a steaming cup in both hands. "Ibis thinly sent this to you." He shivered, dressed only in light wool. She took the cup. "Tell him thank you." The boy made a feeble bow and turned so fast to run back that his foot slipped and he fell to one knee. The cup contained tea, and it felt wonderfully hot in her chilled fingers. The steam warmed her face as she sipped. Ibis had prepared a wonderful meal for everyone. Laying it out across the tables, Arist had only glanced at the plates. It was too early to eat. She rarely ate breakfast. Her stomach needed time to wake up before going to work. That morning, the thought of food was apparent. The stomach was knotted and riding high. She knew she would pay later for skipping the meal. Somewhere along the road, she would regret not having eaten something. The stable smelled of wet straw and horse manure. Both doors stood open, leaving a path for the wind, which jingled the harnesses. Gusts harassed the lanterns and ripped through gaps in the walls, producing a loud fluttering howl, as if a massive flock of sparrows were taking flight. Every few seconds, "I'll take that, Your Highness," a groom offered. He was a short, stocky, older man with a bristling beard and a knit hat that slumped to one side. He had 2 bridles draped around his neck and a bale hook hanging from his belt. He grabbed her pack and walked to the wagon. You'll be riding back here." He told her, "I've made a right comfortable spot for you. I got a soft pillow from a chambermaid. And 3 thick blankets. You'll ride in style, you will." "Thank you, but I'll be needing a horse and a side saddle." The groom looked at her with a blank stare. His mouth open, his lips thick and cracked. "But your highness, where you're going? It's quite a ways from here. Ain't it right off the weather too? You won't want to be atop no horse." She smiled at him, then turned and walked up the aisle between the stores. The aisle was brick, the stores were dirt, and everything lay covered in bits of straw. The rear ends of a dozen horses faced her, swishing tails and shifting weight from one hoof to the other. Cobwebs gathered in corners, catching hay and forming snails' nests. Even in the rafters, the walls all bore a stain. A full foot from the bottom, the high manure mark, she guessed. She stopped without thinking before a stall. This was where she had spent a night with Hilfred, where he had held her or he had stroked her hair, kissed her. A pleasant-looking gray mare was there now. The horse turned her head, and Arista saw a white nose and dark eyes. "What you call this one?" The groom slapped the horse's rump fondly. "This here girl is called Princess." Arista smiled. "Saddle her for me." Arista led Princess out into the courtyard. The groom followed close behind with the wagon. The team of forces puffed, great clouds into the morning air. A crowd of people came out to the steps of the palace, wrapped in dark cloaks, heads draped in hoods. They spoke in soft voices and whispers, clustering in small groups. Some cried. The gathering reminded Arista of a funeral. She knew many of the faces, even if she didn't know all the names. Belinda Lennoxlin stood beside Dennick, Lanier and Belinda Pickering, as they said goodbye to Marvin and Ulrich. Marvin threw his head back, laughing at something. It sounded wrong, too loud, too much effort. With a left hand, Belinda dabbed at her eyes with a cloth. A right hand gripped Marvin's sleeve with white fingers. Alenda looked over the crowd, managing to catch Myron's attention. She waved to him. The monk paused in his efforts to pet the noses of the team of Brand geldings harnessed to the wagon. He smiled and hesitantly waved back, not far away. 2 men Arista did not know spoke with the Empress. One wore a plumed cavalier hat, a red and black doubled high leather boots, and a heavy sailor's wrap. The other man towered over everyone present. His head reminded Arista of a barrel, wide and flat on top and bottom, with vertical creases like wooden slats. He was mostly bald and missing one ear, and sporting several ugly scars, one that split his lower lip. A thick untailored cape draped him like a tent. Arista speculated he had merely cut a hole in a thick blanket and pulled his head through. At his side was a huge crude axe, hanging naked from a rough bit of raw leather. "Do what the Empress tells you," Arista heard the sailor say. "She take good care of you until I come back." A few feet away, Hadrian stood speaking with a man, a refugee from Melanger. He was a viscount, but she didn't know his name. An attractive young woman rushed up, went up on her toes and kissed Hadrian. The viscount called her Emerald. "What kind of name is that?" Adrian hugged her, pulling Emerald off the ground. She giggled, her left leg bent at the knee. She was very cute, smaller than Arista, thinner, younger. The princess wondered if he had dozens of women like this all over Avron, or if this Emerald was special. Watching them together, seeing his arms around her, watching them kiss, she felt an emptiness, as if there were a hole inside her. She felt an ache of pain, like a weight pressing on her chest, and told herself to look away. After another minute, she actually did. 12 riding horses and a hitch to the wagon. 14 animals in all stood waiting in the snow. On 4 of the horses sat 5 young boys. Squires Hadrian had called them, who had recruited to act as servants and watch after the animals. All Arista knew about them were their names: Renwick Elbright, Bran Kinney, and Mintz. The last boy was so small that he rode double with kind. They waited sitting straight and trying to look serious and grown up. The book board filled with their provisions and covered with a heavy canvas top had its wheels removed and was fitted with snow runners huddled on the forward bench, glancing only occasionally at the crowd and adjusting his hood with a disgusted, angry expression was the dwarf beneath his heavy brows, beneath his large nose and frowning mouth. His long braided beard had recently been cut short. The dwarf's fingers absently played with it, the way a tongue might play with the space left by a missing tooth. He grumbled and sneered. But she could not find any sympathy for him. It was the first time she'd seen Magnus since the day he had slammed the door in her face, less than a week after his hand had murdered her father. Royce Melbourne stood alone in the snow. He waited silently across the courtyard near the gate, his dark cloak fluttering lightly with the breeze. A small shadow near the wall. No one appeared to notice him except Adrian, who kept a watchful eye, and Magnus, who repeatedly glanced over nervously. Royce never looked at any of them. His head faced the gate, the city, and the road beyond. Amelia exited the palace wrapped in heavy wool. She pushed through the crowd and crossed the yard to Arista. Trapped under her arm was a parchment, wrinkled and creased. In her hands was what looked to be a short whip. "This is for you," she said, holding out what Arista now recognized as the severed half of the dwarf's beard, still neatly braided. Being aware of Magnus's tendency to disappear, Medina took the precaution of snipping some hair for you. She nodded. "Give her my thanks. Do you know where Gaunt is? He's coming." The castle doors opened once more, and Deegan Gaunt stepped out. He was clad in a belted, furland hoopland and a chaperone hat, with a full burrow wrapped around his head, and a long cornet that streamed nearly to the ground. The elaborate hoopland was worn, complete with huge bell sleeves and a long train, which dragged across the ground, softly grating the snow behind him. "The future emperor has arrived," Amelia whispered, and then added, "He thought his clothes needed to reflect his future status, and he didn't want to be cold. Can he ride in that?" Before the secretary could answer, a page ran out before Gaunt, carrying 2 large silk pillows and a blanket. He proceeded to lay them out on the wagon's bench. The dwarf forgot his beer does. He looked at the pillows beside him with another sneer. "I'm not riding beside a dwarf. Get that runt off of there." Gaunt said agent will drive the wagon. When no one made a move, he added, "Do you hear me?" Arista pulled herself onto Princess's back, swung her leg over the side saddle horn, and trotted rapidly to Gaunt. She reined the animal only a few feet short of God, causing him to step back. She glared down at him. "Magnus rides on the wagon because he's too short for the horses, and he is perfectly capable of driving it, true." The dwarf nodded. "Good, but I do not wish to travel with him." "Then you may ride on a horse, don't side. I've been told this will be a long journey, and I do not wish to spend it on the back of a horse. Then you can sit beside Magnus. By the way, it doesn't matter. I just told you I don't want to sit beside a dwarf." God glared at Magnus with a grimace. "And I don't appreciate your tone. And I don't appreciate your obstinacy. You can ride beside Magnus, ride on a horse, or walk, for all I care. But regardless, we are leaving." She raised her head and her voice mount up at her command. They all found their rides and climbed aboard. Looking livid, Gaunt stood staring at the princess. Arista pulled on the reins and turned her mare to face Medina, who was holding Ali's hand. This left Gaunt facing the rear of her mare. "I swear I will do all I can to find the horn and return it as soon as possible." "I know," Medina replied. "May Maribor guide your path." Ulrich and Marvin rode at the head of the party. Although the king didn't know where they were going, he had studied many maps but only set foot out of Melongar on 3 occasions. Ulrich had never traveled that far south, and he had never heard of Ambertonley before the meeting. He trusted someone would tell him when to turn. Arista most likely. They traveled the old southern road, which Ulrich knew from maps, ran all the way to Tortle 4 at the southern tip of Delgos. As they passed through the Adend Aldarad, the road was little more than a cleft in the ridge that sliced through the Rocky Mountains as it dropped down from the plateau of Warwick to the plain of Renyard. Snow drifted in the pass such that on occasion they needed to dismount and pull the horses through, but the road remained passable. Months of sun followed by bitter nights had left a crust on the surface that crunched under the horses' hooves and left icicles hanging thick like frozen waterfalls. Across the face of the rocky cliffs, the heights of winter was over. Days grew longer, and while the world lay buried, it wasn't as deep as it once had been. No one talked much during the course of the morning. Gaunt and Magnus were particularly quiet, neither saying a word nor looking at each other. Deegan said bundled his long train, wrapping his body and head, so only his nose remained exposed. Magnus appeared oblivious to the cold as he drove the wagon with bare, ruddy hands. His breath iced his mustache and what remained of his beard, leaving him with a frozen grimace of irritated misery. Ulrich felt better seeing his discomfort. Royce and Hadrian rode at the rear of the party, and Ulrich never noticed either speak. Royce rode absently, his hood up, his head down, bobbing as if you are asleep. The 5 boys were with them. They whispered among themselves occasionally, as servants were prone to do. The sailor they called Wyatt rode beside his giant friend. Ulrich had never seen a man that size before. They had provided him a draft horse, and still his feet hung nearly to the ground, the stirrups left dangling. Wyatt had whispered a few words to the giant of the stud, but Eldon never spoke. The only conversation, the only break from the drowning crunch of snow and panting breath of the animals, was that of Myron and Arista. A quarter hour didn't pass without the monk pointing out some curiosity to her. Ulrich had forgotten Myron's fascination with everything, no matter how trivial. Myron found the 20-foot icicles hanging from the cliffside nothing short of a miracle. He also pointed out designs he found in the rock formations. One he swore looked like the face of a bearded man. Arista smiled politely and even offered a laugh on occasion. It was a girl's laugh, high and light, natural and unburdened. Ulrich would feel self-conscious to laugh so openly. His sister didn't seem to care what those around her thought. Ulrich hated how she had taken charge when setting out, as much as he had enjoyed the look on Gon's face when she had barked at him in the courtyard. He disliked the bold way his sister acted. If only she had given him the time to act. He was the king after all. The Empress might have given Arrest authority to organize the expedition that didn't extend to leading it. She'd never satisfactorily explained why she was along. Anyway, he had assumed she would ride quietly in the wagon and leave commanding the venture to him. Marty should have known better, given her theatrics in the courtyard. It was surprising that she still rode side saddle and hadn't taken to wearing bridges. They escaped the tight pass before noon, as morning clouds finally gave up their tight grip on the world. Ere the land dropped away, leaving a magnificent view to the south. Ulrich spotted Ratibor in the distant valley. The whole city appeared no larger than his thumb, and from that distance it looked beautiful. A clustered glen in a sea of forest and field. Their patron announced from the rear, pointing toward a shining river to the east. You can see Ambertonley, sort of down near the Burnham River, where it bends. See there how the land rises up into 3 hills. Yes, that's it. Arista agreed, I remember. She looked up at the sky. We won't make it today. We could spend the night in Ratibor. Hayden offered it's only a few miles. We could reach it by nightfall. Well, I don't. Arista began. We will head to Ratibor, Eric declared quickly, causing Arista to look at him in surprise. I was just going to say, she went on, if we there east now. We'll be that much closer in the morning. Mother's no road, Aura told her. We can't be wandering through the snowy fields. Why not? Who knows how deep that snow is and what lies beneath? Royce can find us a route through. He's good at that, Adrian said. That's what I was thinking, Arista agreed. No, Ratibor is a much better choice. Ulrich said loudly, we got a good night's rest. Then push on at first light and be there by noon. But Ulrich, you heard my decision. He kicked his horse and trotted down the road. Feeling their eyes on his back, hooves trotted up behind him. He expected to be a sister and dreaded the argument, but he wouldn't back down. Ulrich turned, hardly only to see more than with his hair flying. The rest of the group followed 20 feet behind them, but they were moving in his direction. He led his horse slow to a walk. What was that all about? Marvin asked, moving alongside, where the two horses naturally fell into the same pace. Oh, nothing beside just trying to remind her who's king. She forgets, you know, so many years, so few changes. Marvin said softly, brushing the hair out of his eyes. What's that supposed to mean? Marvin only smiled. Personally, I prefer your idea. Who wants to sleep in the snow if you can have a bed? Besides, I'd like to see Ratibor. It was on our list, remember. Are ignored. We're also supposed to go to Total 4. Yeah, but let's say that for another time. Since it's under new management and all more often mentioned. I still can't believe we're on our way to Persepolis. That was always the big prize. The dream, still hoping to find the Tesla codes. Marvin chuckled, that's right. I was going to discover the secret techniques of the Tesla Knights. You remember that, do you? I was supposed to be the first. 1 in 1,000 years to possess that knowledge. I would have guarded it jealously and been the greatest warrior alive. Marvin glanced behind them. Not much chance of that now. Even if I did find them, I could never match Adrian. He grew up with it and was taught by a master. That was a stupid dream anyway. A boy's fantasy, the kind of thing a kid thinks before actually seeing blood on a blade. When you're young, you think you can do anything. You know, and then he sighed and turned away. Barrack noticed his hand go up to his face briefly before settling on the palm of his sword. Only it was not Marvin's sword. I didn't notice before. Eric told him, nodding toward Marvin's side. This is the first time I've worn it. He pulled his hand away self-consciously. I've wanted it for so long. I used to see my father wielded so beautiful, so elegant. I dreamed of it sometimes. All I ever wanted to do was hold it, swing it, and hear it sing in the air for me. Barrack nodded. What about you? Marvin asked. Are you still interested in finding Navrin's crown? The king huffed and might have laughed if the statement had not seemed so ironic. I already have a crown. Yeah, Marvin said sadly. Ulrich spoken, a voice just loud enough for Marvin to hear. Sometimes the price of dreams is achieving them. They were just closing the city gate for the night when the party arrived in Ratibor. Arista didn't recognize the guard. He was a burly, balding man in a rough-stitched rawhide coat who waved at them impatiently to get inside. Where's a good place to find lodgings for the night? My good man, Oric asked, circling his mount on the guard as he went about locking down the city. Aquesta, the man laughed. I meant here. I knows what you meant, you said gruffly. The gnome has open rooms. I think the gnome. It's a tavern, Arista explained. The laughing gnome, King Street and Glore. The guard eyed her curiously. Thank you, she said, quickly kicking our horse this way. The heavy scent of manure and urine that Arista had remembered as the prominent smell of Ratibor was replaced by the thick smell of wood smoke. other than that the city had changed little from the last time she'd been there. Streets ran in awkward lines, forcing adjoining buildings to conform to the resulting spaces, often with strange results, such as sharps in the shapes of wedges of cheese, the wooden planks that used to bridge the rivers of muck lay buried beneath a thick layer of snow. The winter had stolen the leaves from the trees, and the wind ripped along empty streets. Nothing but the snow moved. Arista had expected winter would brighten the place and bury the filth, but instead she found it bleak and barren. She rode in the lead now behind her. She could hear Ulrich grumbling. He spoke too low for her to catch the words, but his tone was clear. He was unhappy with her again. Any other time she might have fallen back, apologized for whatever it was she had done wrong, and tried to make him feel better, but she was cold, hungry, and tired. She wanted to get to the tavern. His feelings could hurt, at least until they were settled as they approached Central Square. She tried to keep her eyes down and focus on the snow, where Princess walked, but she couldn't resist. When they were in the exact middle of the square, her eyes ignored her will and looked up. The post was still there, but the ropes were gone, dark and slender, nearly blending into the background. It was a physical reminder of what might have been.